Composition and Literature, a Rhetoric for Critical Writing. Preface. To the instructor, English teachers have long wanted a text that smooths the transition from writing courses to literature courses. Such a text should assume neither complete mastery of basic composition skills nor perfected techniques of critical reading and writing. We have written Composition and Literature realizing that while literature courses usually involve writing, these courses serve different purposes at different institutions or even within the same institution. For some, improvement of writing may be a major aim of the literature course and an integral part of class coverage. In other courses, there may be little or no time to review the basics of essay writing, even though some students still need such attention after completing required writing courses. We hope this text can be useful in both situations. We see it as a bridge between the general freshman composition course and courses in the intensive study of literature. Composition and literature might be used as the core rhetoric for a literature class, reinforcing compositional skills and applying them to the specific discipline of literary study. Or the text might be used as a reference for students who are not yet independent writers about literature. In either case, the text helps expand the writer's repertoire of skills for crafting the critical essay, from the large-scale concerns of invention and generating a thesis to such matters as paragraph construction and incorporating evidence. We assume that composition and literature will probably be used with an anthology of literature, so we did not try to be comprehensive in choosing literary works for the appendix. The 2 stories and 10 poems are the basis for sample student writing that, we hope, is representative when illustrating weaknesses and believable when illustrating strengths. It would, of course, be helpful for the students to be familiar with these works when reading the text. Also, we expect that some of our writing exercises may be more appropriate than others for different courses and students. The exercises are easily adaptable to works outside the appendix, namely works your students are studying. Lastly, while Chapter 1 should probably be covered early, the other chapters might be arranged to suit a particular curriculum. They are fairly independent in their coverage. While we do not have separate chapters on different literary genres, you will notice that many chapters are divided into sections on fiction, drama, and poetry, with the view that common literary elements are the more compelling structural principle. Knowing how complex literary study is, we tread a middle ground between oversimplifying for clarity's sake and presenting the various possible critical approaches to literature. We anticipate that our audience will be beginning writers and students of literature. Hopefully we have not aimed too high or too low. Our view throughout is that a complete and rewarding experience depends on good critical writing. While composition and literature are frequently separate courses at many schools, we hope that intermingling them in this text will help strengthen both and provide students with the tools to become more sensitive readers and more thoughtful, organized, and responsive writers, not just in one class, but throughout their college years. To the student, writing about literature is a complex task, but the result is a richer reading experience. Critical writing involves reading with perception, not only the literal words on the page, but the implied emotions and thoughts which are subtly woven into the literal meaning. It involves not only understanding the works of literature, but responding to them. Your thoughts about an author's ideas might form the basis for an exploration in an essay. Writing about literature also involves the skills of crafting a critical essay. You first have the opportunity to explore the literary work and your reactions, and then you have the responsibility of organizing and supporting your thoughts in a convincing manner for your own audience, your instructor, and perhaps your classmates. We hope that composition and literature will aid you in applying what you already know about different kinds of writing to writing an essay about literature. We have tried not to oversimplify a complex task, and yet we could not cover in one book all the possible kinds of critical approaches to literature which you may discover. All we hope to do is make a start and join you for the beginning of what we hope will be a lifetime love of reading and writing. Acknowledgements. Acknowledged. Chapter 1. The Nature of Critical Insight. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the English Romantic poet, says that a poet brings the whole soul of man into activity, and we might add so do a short story writer, a novelist, and a playwright. Coleridge is saying that the reader becomes actively involved with the literary work in a special way and is not simply a passive receiver of words. In a sense, each reader has to remake the poem, story, or play with each reading. But, you might say, the author wrote the work, so all the reader has to do is read it. And what does the reader's participation have to do with critical writing? We should explain from the start that critical reading and writing are not negative activities. Criticism can and often does praise. But what is more important than saying something is good or bad is understanding why and how the reader responds to it in a certain way. Notice that we said why and how the reader responds rather than why and how the work affects the reader. There is a great deal of difference, and it has to do with the nature of critical insight. Who, what, where, and when, how, why. To get at the nature of critical insight, let's compare and contrast the similar activities of reading literature, listening to music, and looking at a painting. All these activities can be examined under the familiar headings of the journalistic questions who, what, where, and when, how, why. More precisely, we can ask 1. Who are you when you read literature, listen to music, or look at a painting? 2. What is the subject of your attention in these activities? 3. Where and when did these activities take place? 4. How do you achieve critical insight? 5. Why is critical insight valuable? Who? Who are you when you read literature, listen to music, or look at a painting? The answer is more complex than you might imagine. Who you are as a reader, a listener, or a viewer depends on all the experiences you bring to the particular activity and, more importantly, on which experiences you consciously or unconsciously select to influence your activity. As a reader of literature, you are affected by a whole range of previous reading experiences. You might ask yourself whether you have enjoyed literature before or whether you have perhaps been frustrated by difficult works or insensitive teachers. In particular, have you previously read works of a similar type, a sonnet or a historical novel, for example, or works by the same author? As a music listener or museum goer, much the same applies. You like a certain composer, performer, or painter because of previous experiences. Perhaps school-sponsored activities have been too structured, and the kind of artistic experiences you enjoy you've discovered on your own or with friends. Or perhaps you would never have known about a particular artist without the guidance of a special teacher. Whatever the case, what we bring to an imaginative work largely influences how we experience it. What? What is the subject of the reader's attention? The literary work, of course, the sequence of words, sentences, lines, paragraphs, stanzas, chapters, scenes, acts, and other components and divisions. In short, the text. But think about it. What is a book without a reader? We really can't make any claims other than about its physical and chemical properties. And even then, we would need a scientific observer to interpret the sensory data. Look back at the beginning of this paragraph and you'll notice the phrase, the subject of the reader's attention. We chose the word subject carefully because it implies the idea of something happening inside the reader. The word object would have implied a detached, independent existence for the literary work, which does not adequately cover the author's or the reader's contributions. The critical reader-writer needs to think of the text as providing the opportunity for a particular set of experiences. The what of listening to music is similar. We don't listen to a score, the musical notation on paper. Rather, we listen to the performance. The composer must receive primary credit for the harmony, rhythm, tonal color, and structure, but for these musical elements to be realized, there must be a performance, a heard performance. We don't need a performer when we look at a painting, but we do need something more than just canvas and paint. We need the felt painting, whether gazed at long with puzzlement, fascination, or understanding, or passed by quickly with disinterest or disgust. It's no accident that we speak of the different forms of art with the same language, often blending the senses. We consider the movement of colors and tension in poetic lines, the sounds of colors, and so on, as we try to get hold of and understand our responses, and how it is that the artifact becomes a work working on us. The important point is that in all the imaginative activities that we've been discussing, we cannot speak of the subject of critical insight without considering the artistic consumer, the reader, the listener, and the viewer. We certainly should not ignore the shaping influence of the artistic work. Indeed, we must constantly find our responses rooted in the work. But equally, we should not ignore the interaction with a human being, that is, with ourselves, that the work enables. To understand that interaction is the goal of critical insight. Where and when? Where and when did these imaginative activities take place? Place, time, and the general scene are important factors in critical insight, affecting not only the completeness of the experience, but the pleasure we take and even our purpose. It is possible to read War and Peace in a noisy bar, but not with the degree of attention necessary to appreciate the complex relationship among Tolstoy's panoramic cast of characters. On the other hand, a noisy bar might be just the place to enjoy country blues or jazz rock, though you wouldn't expect to hear a Schubert quartet there. Da Vinci's Mona Lisa hanging on the fence around a construction site? Hardly, but you often find there the ingenious fresco of a budding local artist, a work with perhaps no less dedication than that of the Florentine master. It's no accident that libraries and museums are quiet places, or that coughing in a concert hall is taboo. Serious works of art ask for special places and quiet time for concentration. How? How do we achieve critical insight and then write about it? That is the subject of this book, and so the discussion here is a brief overview. Louis Rosenblatt, a teacher and critical theorist, has developed a very useful idea called evoking a work of art, a process that consists of recognizing the purpose of a particular reading, reacting to the text's features, formal divisions such as lines, stanzas, chapters, scenes, and acts, and literary elements such as characterization, setting, and imagery, forming a sense of the work's overall plan and meaning, forming expectations about meaning, character behavior, train of events, and style, finding expectations confirmed or denied, reconsidering or reaffirming the original sense of the overall plan, possibly rereading parts or all of the work, and coming to a personal understanding of the work, an understanding which may be modified over a short or long period of time depending on the reader's personal growth, further reading, or contact with other readers. We'll discuss specific techniques you can use to sharpen your critical insight during this process in the next chapter, but before that, we need to answer the central question. Why? Why? Why should we bother at all with critical reading and writing? One answer is practical. Many of the skills developed in reading and writing about literature can be applied to other subjects, disciplines, and professions. You're probably using this text in a course with varying emphases on improving writing skills and appreciating literature. While you may never again write about literary works, you will most likely have many professional opportunities to summarize, draw inferences from, account for, speculate about, or evaluate the written thoughts of others. In technical reports, budget analyses, diagnoses, legal briefs, personality profiles, policy recommendations, and so on. Reading and writing critically about literature develop the skills of reading closely, analyzing the writer's choices, thinking and feeling from different points of view, and making judgments. Another answer to the question of why we want to develop the skill of critical insight is to understand ourselves better. If you recall that the text, the musical score, and the painting are nothing in themselves but physical objects, you'll realize that it is your own responses, prompted by and grounded in those objects, that are the focus of critical insight. Yes, we want to know how the artist crafted the artifact, and yes, we must look closely to understand, but we must always come back to the effects engendered in us, to the work that is remade and synthesized into the experience we recognized as insight. Now that we have given a brief overview of critical insight, we can look more closely at its two components in literary study: critical reading and critical writing. Critical reading. The basics of all good writing about literature is careful reading. Good readers will adjust their approach to the material being read and their purpose for reading. You wouldn't read the whole encyclopedia just to find out about a communication among dolphins, nor would you read the whole sports section to find out how your favorite baseball player did in last night's game. You might read closely an important chapter in your earth science text on what you were going to be tested. You might also skim less important chapters, just in case you were quizzed on those too. You might read leisurely through a mystery novel which you picked up for pleasure, maybe even turn to the last chapter and decide not to finish the middle. However, you would have to read a novel, the subject of your critical essay, from beginning to end. Our concern in this text is not with reading just for pleasure, though we hope that by becoming a better critical reader, you will increase your pleasure in this type of reading also. For the purpose of this text, however, we'll assume that you're reading literature to write about it. Reading literature analytically is different from reading textbooks or expository essays, such as those found in magazines and journals. The main purpose of textbooks or expository prose is to inform and sometimes to entertain. By contrast, the author who writes a work of literature, a short story, play, or poem, may have many purposes in mind: to inform, to entertain, to provide opportunities for personal insight and feeling, to please with form and sound, or, in short, to create an artistic statement. Unlike a textbook or an expository essay, a work of literature usually implies as much as it states. Part of the reader's appreciation comes from an ability to read literature on more than a literal level and to notice its artistry. A good reader will adjust the reading approach to the author's purpose. As we suggested in the previous section, reading a poem, a play, or a story is more akin to looking at a painting than it is to reading a textbook. A literary work deserves to be pondered, just as you cannot merely glance at a fine painting or listen casually to a serious piece of music and fully appreciate or understand it, so you cannot skim through a good story, play, or poem and truly see the artistry and meaning. Yes, you might know the subject or the plot, but that superficial experience of the work would be like glancing at Vincent van Gogh's painting Starry Night and just seeing a picture of a town at night. You might miss the flaming trees in the foreground, the swirling light around the stars and the moon, the rolling clouds and hills. Certainly you would miss the wild brushstrokes and forego the impression made by the small, sleepy town surrounded by nature and motion, and the contrasts made by the dark land and the bursts of light in the sky. Would the painting be as memorable or as pleasurable an experience without these details? Probably not. In order to be able to write critically about literature, you must read the work through, sometimes more than once, with a sensitive eye and a careful ear. In discussing literature and writing critical essays, you'll learn to relate to literature on 3 different levels: literal, inferential, and evaluative. First, you must understand the work literally. That is, you must be able to tell what the story, poem, or play is about in your own words. Second, you must be able to draw appropriate inferences from the work, to extract a theme, though it may not be stated, to draw conclusions about characters that are implied but remain unsaid, to notice the mood or feeling communicated indirectly by a setting. You must notice details which fit together, patterns which will serve as the basis for your conclusions. Last, and you cannot read effectively on this level unless you have a firm grasp of the first 2, you must be able to evaluate a work, to judge its artistic merits and shortcomings. The critical essays which we'll be looking at and those which you'll be writing will focus, for the most part, on the second level of reading, the inferential. You'll need to demonstrate in your essays not only that you understand the literal meaning of the work, but that you're able to draw appropriate conclusions about character, setting, theme, imagery, tone, point of view, and other literary elements. The third level, the evaluative stage of reading, we'll leave for later in your literary studies, though you may be asked in some courses to evaluate literary works or to review performances of plays or movies. You should be aware of these 3 levels of reading, literal, inferential, and evaluative, and be able to distinguish them in your responses to literature. You should recognize that in recounting or summarizing a work, you are relating to the work only on a literal level. You should know that when you're drawing a conclusion, an inference, which is suggested by the work and therefore needs to be supported by details from the work, literal details, you're on the right level for writing a critical essay. If you find yourself drawing inaccurate inferences, you should take one step back and return to the literal level, what the work actually says, to check your understanding. If you find yourself saying, "This is a good poem," or "This is a poorly written story," you are evaluating the work and must show not only a thorough understanding of it, but also how it fits criteria you identify. Reading tactics that work. Reading a literary work for the purpose of writing a critical essay differs from your usual reading. The following steps can help you prepare for this special kind of writing. Of course, you may vary the steps as you get comfortable and better acquainted with critical writing. 1. Preview. Previewing is preparing to read. It should take you only a few minutes and may yield information which will enable you to read with more understanding and perception. When previewing, you should take note of the title of the work and the subtitle, if there is one. What expectations does the title cause you to have? What expectation does the title of a poem such as The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock raise? Sometimes the title is very important. Sometimes it's not important. Later as you read, you'll ask, have my expectations been fulfilled? If not, is there a reason why the author raised these expectations? You should also note the author of the work. Have you read anything else by him? What do you know about it? You should take note the publication date or the dates the author lived. It might help you to understand Wilfred Owen's war poems more fully, for example, if you knew that he was writing about the time of World War I. Read any background material or introductory notes provided in your text. Take note of the stage directions, the scenery notes and cast of characters when you're preparing to read a play. Take note of the table of contents of a novel, how the work is divided. Leaf through a short story to see if it is segmented. Note how many sections there are. Take a look at the typography of a poem. How is it laid out on the page? Is it written in stanzas? Are the lines and divisions fairly regular? Skim any poem you are about to read for unfamiliar vocabulary. It is harder to decipher the meaning of unfamiliar words from their context in a poem than a prose work because poetry frequently uses language in novel ways. Unless you're familiar with the words, you're likely to miss the full meaning. Sometimes even familiar words are used in unfamiliar ways in poems and should be looked up in a dictionary to see if there are any alternate meanings. In fact, when you refer to a dictionary to clarify a poet's diction, you should look not only at all the denotative, literal meanings of the words, but also at any connotative meanings, positive or negative implied meanings. You should also check the history or derivation of the words, which may shed some light on why the poet chose it.
After you've made these preparations, you're ready to begin to read. 2. Read the work thoroughly, making notes. You must read a work of literature from beginning to end at least once, even if you intend to write about only a portion of the work. You cannot appreciate the full meaning of any part until you've seen the whole. Can you imagine writing an essay on the Mona Lisa's smile without having looked at the whole painting? Similarly, you cannot write intelligently about the effectiveness of a part of a story without studying the whole story. As you read, take note of any striking features. Remember, a work of literature is an artifact. It is the result of many careful choices made by the author. A character's name is not accidental. It was chosen. The setting is not arbitrary. It also was chosen. Get used to asking yourself such questions as, why did the author pick this name, the time of day, this place? If you own the book, underline phrases you see repeated. Mark an important turning of events. Circle a pattern of images. If the relationships between characters seem very complex, as in Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, you might make yourself a crude family tree to help you keep track of who is who. If a work is segmented, take a minute at the end of each chapter, scene, or stanza to jot down a phrase or sentence summarizing what the section was about. Looking back over these summary notes, you'll be able to discover patterns that unify the work. But most important, don't be afraid to make the work your own by reacting to what you've read. Your written notes express the early stages of your developing insight. 3. Question. After reading the work, you'll be able to decide what you want to write about. Perhaps your instructor has provided you with a list of suggested topics. Now would be the time to consider them carefully and choose one. If your instructor has left the topic open, you might try to generate your own topic using the pre-writing methods covered in Chapter 2. You might also consider analyzing one of the various literary elements that are covered in this text: character, setting, theme, point of view, structure, imagery, or tone. You may need to limit your topic to one aspect of a literary element. For example, in a 3-page essay, it would probably be sufficient to discuss just one character in a novel. After you have a topic, whether it was assigned by your instructor or chosen by you, you should formulate some questions to help you explore it in a meaningful way. Refer to the section in Chapter 2 on formulating questions, or to the pre-writing sections in the chapter on character setting and theme, and so on. 4. Review the work with a purpose. Having chosen a topic and formulated some questions, you should return to the work with your questions in mind and reread it. You may not have to reread the entire work from beginning to end, but you should try to answer your questions accurately and fully. Write down your answers and any new ideas or questions that may be generated by your review of the work. Now you're ready to begin finding your focus and assembling your ideas. Reading poetry and drama. Most poems and plays are meant to be read out loud. Sound adds a whole new dimension to our appreciation of these genres. Sometimes lines which seem obscure on the written page are made clear by the intonations of a voice. Don't be timid about reading out loud to see how a poem sounds, or having someone read it to you. Listening to recordings of poems and plays can also add to your enjoyment and understanding. While we suggest rereading a work before you write about it, poems in particular frequently should be read many times. A poem can unfold new meaning with each reading if you'll create the opportunities for this to happen. Critical writing. If we can read literary works on literal, inferential, and evaluative levels, we can also write on those levels, depending on our purposes. Purpose in critical writing is determined by the relationships among the major parts of the traditional communication triangle. A message surrounded by a writer, audience, and subject. Writer. As the writer of a critical essay, you have read a literary work and have something to say about it. You may play a number of roles: the student who is fulfilling an assignment, either in or out of class, the researcher who looks for biographical or historical clues to shed light on some aspect of the work, the reviewer who profiles and evaluates the work in a local newspaper or literary magazine. By the time you start writing in any of these situations, you may have a fairly well-formed idea of what you want to say, but more often than not, you'll be unsure, at a loss, and fumbling for words. This is perfectly all right. Many things can inhibit writing and create the classic writer's block: fear of failure and negative judgment, low grades, not knowing how to start and plan the essay, immediate physical distractions, extreme self-consciousness from the pressures of other courses or personal problems, and not understanding obscurities in the literary work itself. The terror of the blank page has haunted many a professional as well. However, one way experienced writers keep the terror under control is by not losing sight of the total picture of the communication triangle: audience, subject, and message, a picture which you're developing now. Whatever role you play as a writer, your basic activity is writing, and we want to stress that you can discover what to say by writing, with special free-form and closed-form writing done before the first word of the first paragraph. We'll discuss these pre-writing techniques in the next chapter, but for now we cannot emphasize strongly enough that critical insight comes from and not before writing. Audience. Audience analysis, the ability to anticipate your reader's needs and expectations, is one of the most basic writing skills, though it is frequently ignored by inexperienced writers. The audience for your critical essay, in most cases, will be your teacher, but it might also be fellow classmates, a prospective publisher of your essay, and, if you're fortunate, the readers of that publication. While some readers of critical essays will not have read the literary work and thus will need some background material, most of the time your audience will be familiar with the work and, consequently, will be more interested in your own particular insights than in a simple paraphrase or rehash of the plot. This, in fact, is the expectation that the writers of the sample essays in this text have of their audience. Keeping your audience's foreknowledge and expectations in front of you at all times is essential for effective critical writing. Subject. The subject of a critical essay is rarely the entire literary work. Usually you'll be writing about one or more aspects or literary elements of the work that can be covered thoroughly in a relatively short space. Your major concern in this part of the communication triangle is with the essay topic, a word that is interchangeable with subject. As we mentioned in the critical reading section, there are three possible subject or topic situations. 1. The topic is open, and you must discover one that is both interesting and manageable. 2. You must choose one from a number of designated topics. Or 3. You must write on an assigned topic. Thorough topic analysis, like audience analysis, is essential for effective critical writing. Often there is room for selecting and narrating even within an assigned topic, and once you have a topic worth exploring, you need to have skills in sticking to it, not wandering off on tangents. The first part of Chapter 2 presents detailed topic strategies for selecting, narrowing, and staying with a topic. Message. This is the essay itself. What you have to say about the selected literary elements and how you say it. Like any expository or argumentative essay, a critical essay needs a point, a thrust, a main idea, a thesis, to focus your reader's attention and to lead your reader through the middle paragraphs to the conclusion. We discuss the special skills of trying out tentative theses and committing yourself to one in Chapter 9. As a piece of writing, an artifact in its own right, your essay needs organization, clarity of thought, and literary perception, paragraph coherence and unity, appropriate style or voice, and technical control of grammar and mechanics. All of these features come together in a good essay, so it will not help to have an obsessive concern for one over the other. Each compositional element works with the others to express your insight on the subject, and all the elements deserve your attention, particularly in the later stages of writing and rewriting. You may, however, discover, with your instructor's help, that you need to give extra attention to a particular compositional element. Independent study or work with a tutor or a writing lab can help polish weak aspects of your delivery, but you should always keep in mind that all these elements work together in the finished essay, and that their success in communicating your ideas to a reader can be one of the most satisfying intellectual achievements. Composition texts often distinguish between writing as a product and writing as a process. The writing product is what you present to your audience. The essay you offer in hope that it will recreate your experience of and insight into the literary work. The finished product is your best shot and the end result of all your decisions. It should be something you are proud to claim as your own. The writing process is all the things you do to create the product. The major mistake most writers make is trying to put their message into a final product too early. When a writer ignores or casually rushes through the early exploratory stages of writing, what the ancients called inventions, he or she risks superficial coverage of the subject and a shallow level of critical insight. In Chapter 2, we'll show you how to use the inventional techniques of pre-writing that help fill that bothersome, even terrifying blank page. Exercises. 1.7. Read the two critical essays below. How would you assess each writer's picture of the communication triangle? More specifically, how complete is each writer's understanding of himself or herself as a writer, and of the audience, the subject, and the message? In To the Stonecutters, Robinson Jeffers examines the longevity of poetry. By the symbolism of stone, he creates a comparison between poets and stonecutters, as well as between poems and sculptures. The speaker begins by questioning the work of poetry through the imagery of comparison, but finally reaches some consolation by reflecting on the enduring pleasure that art provides. If the comparison is true, then by showing the vulnerability of stone, knowing rocks split, records fall down, scaling the thaws, wearing the rain, Jeffers shows poetry's impermanence. Poets, too, are for defeated, challengers of oblivion, having failed to achieve genuine immortality. Such metaphors as build his monument, blot it out, the blithe earth die, and die blind and blackened to the earth, show the similarity of the two kinds of creation. In spite of the regret about destructive time, Jeffers is able to conclude on a note of hope. Yet stones have stood for 1,000 years, and pain thoughts found, the honey of peace in old poems. These lines suggest serenity through time, and that no matter how outdated or worn works of art might be, they can still give pleasure, whether we look at ancient stone monument or read an old poem. Thus, we can see that Jeffers salvages something positive about the endurance of art through the onslaught of time. Even though stone and poems will wear, they may also survive total destruction and continue providing enjoyment. Jeffers is quite effectively connected and doomed, yet redeemable crafts of stone cutting and writing poetry. We all know that the use of imagery in a poem is to acquire a mental picture of the author's ideas. Using figurative language like metaphors and similes allow us to get a better understanding, while at the same time allowing the author to use fewer words, which is why the poem is so short. In this poem, you can see that Jeffers uses the visual image of stonecutters to show a futile accomplishment. Comparing the two artisans, the poet and the stonecutter, gives us a metaphor in order to sense the image of defeat. Each artist uses his own element to express himself. The poet uses his mind and paper, while the stonecutter uses his brute strength and marble to exhibit his art. In the first line, the word "for defeated" shows that the stonecutter is forever doomed. Poets are too. Yet after all, the poet builds his monument with a mocking gesture. He must know something that the stonecutter doesn't, probably that books have more chance of lasting indoors than sculptures prone to the weather. You've probably had creations that you wanted to last and worried that they would be destroyed by time or neglect. Well, that's the situation in this poem. Chapter 2. Pre-writing. The early stages. The chief problem for any writer is getting the words down on paper. We discussed the habits and conditions that create writer's block in the last chapter. Now we want to suggest some practical techniques for getting words on paper in the early stages of writing a critical essay. One caution, however. It is very easy to get bogged down in such practical techniques and forget the final goal of the writing process, a successful finished essay. The following diagram illustrates the linear process of many writers. Think, outline, write. On the surface, this might seem to be a useful procedure. In fact, in some writing situations, such as an in-class theme, an exam, a press story, or a report with a deadline, an even more streamlined model might appear necessary. But this model ignores a basic fact. Writing is a complex activity. Researchers still do not know precisely how the brain processes all its information to make the choices that result in composition. But we do know that the think, outline, write model oversimplifies the skills involved, and more importantly, it doesn't work well for the inexperienced writer who has to fill in some rather large gaps. We think the diagram on the next page more accurately shows the procedure for effective critical writing. This diagram model has two important features. First, the key components are labeled with verbs or verb phrases which point to actions, things the writer does. The second feature of the diagram is the sequences and directions of activity implied by the arrows. Recall that in the think, outline, write model, the arrows go in just one direction, toward writing. By contrast, in the discovering cluster of this model, activity begins when the writer feels an impulse to write, whether in response to an assignment or a personal interest, and moves into the key discovery activities. You might achieve the major insight for your essay in the discovering sequence while reading the literary work, or you might not reach an insight until you had generated many ideas using pre-writing methods. In other clusters, shaping, the activity ultimately leads towards the finished essay, but the arrows pivoting around the play of ideas suggest that one might return to reading and pre-writing while in the drafting stage. The first draft might prove inadequate because of the incomplete understanding of a literary element, such as setting. The writer would then reread key passages and perhaps try a different pre-writing technique. The point we want to make is that all writing involves the central activity of discovering and shaping, and neither one stops when the other begins. Part 2 of the text covers the shaping skills. Our concern here is to help you discover. How do we discover ideas for critical writing? We may draw on the literary work, all we've previously read, what we've heard in class, what we might specifically research for a topic, and what we've experienced in life. Depending on the circumstances of a particular writing situation, we might have an incredibly vast array of resources to tap, or quite limited opportunities and little time. A skilled writer knows what the opportunities are and how to budget time and energy. A 19th century rhetoric text states that in learning how to write, no one can pump water from a well that is dry. Part of your skill as a writer is to dig the wells and prime the pump. The discovery activities of pre-writing give you all the basic tools. We can break pre-writing down to informal and formal methods. The informal methods are used mostly during and immediately after the impulse to write, and the formal methods are used when the writer gets closer to shaping the essay. Informal methods of pre-writing. Keeping a journal. There is an important difference between a journal and a diary. A diary is a recording of daily events and experiences for later rereadings and relivings. A journal is a series of reflections, thoughts, and feelings that come to the writer, possibly based on events or experiences, but not with the steady ordering by calendar dates that structures a diary. A person who wants to keep in shape may jog, swim, bicycle, or play racquetball regularly. Similarly, a writer who wants to stay limbered up and comfortable with writing writes daily in a journal. You may already have had some experience with keeping a journal, on your own or in another course. It's one of the best ways to get into writing as a regular habit. One of the greatest journal writers was Leonardo da Vinci, who developed the highly idiosyncratic practice of writing his notebook from right to left in a reverse mirror script. In the following two excerpts on scientific and symbolic association with animals, you can see how he uses the journal to express wide-ranging reflections. Flying machine. A bird is an instrument working according to mathematical law, which instrument it is within the capacity of man to reproduce with all its movements. We may therefore say that such an instrument, constructed by man, is lacking in nothing except the life of a bird, and this life needs to be supplied from that of a man. Crocodile, hypocrisy. This animal seizes a man and instantly kills him, and after he is dead it mourns for him with a piteous voice and many tears, and having ended its lament it cruelly devours him. It is thus with the hypocrite, whose face is bathed with tears over every slight thing, showing himself thus to have the heart of a tiger. He rejoices in his heart over another's misfortunes, with a face bedewed with tears. The experiences of one's immediate world are the usual subjects of journal entries, as the following excerpt from Thoreau's private journal of 1858, not the published Walden, illustrates. I have lately been surveying the Walden wood so extensively and minutely that I now see it mapped in the mind's eye, as, indeed on paper, as so many men's woodlots, and am aware when I walk there that I am at a given moment passing from such a one's woodlot to such another's. I fear this particular dry knowledge of the wood's ownership may affect my imagination and fancy, that it will not be easy to see much wilderness and native vigor there as formerly. The styles of the above journal entries may appear formal, but they come from their writer's times. A journal should be in its writer's own personal voice, without filtering. A literary journal has its subject matter, the writer's responses to literary works, and we recommend it highly as a device for recording first and subsequent impressions, not only to focus attention, but to provide possible material to draw on later for critical essays. Your literary journal should be kept in a separate bound notebook, one you carry around with the literary text. There are two fruitful times for making journal entries. A, while you're reading the work, you might note any prominent features, comment on what's happening, or ask questions. And B, after you've finished the work, you can note your first complete reactions and answer questions you raised earlier. An interesting and productive variation on B is to make journal entries on the same work for several days or weeks after finishing the work, and see how your reaction changes, if at all. You might reread the work on several occasions and write down your reactions, noting how your understanding evolves. This technique is especially effective with poetry. Here are a number of journal entries on John Cheever's story, The Country's Husband. Francis Weed sure has it rough. Plane crash and a family fight all in one day. If I'd been in a plane crash, I would have told my story over and over and wanted everyone to listen and know they almost lost me. Maybe Francis is too calm about the crash and should have made a bigger stink about it. Why does he put up with the family? I like the section about the French maid who walked out of the town naked during World War II. Interesting, but it didn't belong with the rest of the story with Shady Hill in modern suburbia. Must be a reason. Beautiful when Francis told off Miss Wrightson, the nosy biddy of Shady Hill. Francis shouldn't have hit Julia. Wonder if they fought before. Probably not, because Julia would have walked out sooner. But he's dependent on her. She keeps his life together, does laundry, dinner, looks after the kid. She's no pushy feminist, but has feelings and finally stands up for herself. He doesn't realize how much he needs her. Wasn't fair of Francis to keep Clayton Thomas from getting a job. Jealous because he has Anne Murchison, the babysitter, and Francis doesn't. Clayton might be smelly, but he deserves a chance. Julia and Trace beard and think he's alright. Pretty cheap of Francis to badmouth him. I can't figure the ending out. Was it right or wrong of Francis to go back to the psychiatrist? He doesn't seem better off for it. Sure, he goes back to the woodwork and Shady Hill is the same as ever, but is he happy? And what's the image of kings in golden suits riding elephants supposed to mean? Maybe Francis wants to be like them, but he knows he can't. Maybe he doesn't know. Notice how the writer uses a comfortable personal voice and doesn't hesitate to indicate uncertainty. Remember, you don't have to worry about form, grammar, punctuation, spelling, or word choice. Focus on your own literary responses, whether positive or negative, pleasing or painful, and express them as they come to you. Free writing. The technique of free writing is used to get words on paper in an accelerated fashion. It's often recommended when a writer has a severe case of writer's block, but even the most experienced writers find it very productive in the early stages of composition. The basic technique is simply to put pen or pencil to paper and force yourself to write non-stop for a period of 10 minutes or more. Sound impossible? Think you couldn't possibly have enough to say or write for 10 minutes? Okay, then for 10 minutes, write, "I can't think of anything to say." We guarantee you'll find something to say, if only to relieve the boredom of repetition. Here is part of a student's 10-minute free writing exercise which began this way. I've got nothing to say. 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 What's this for, anyway? A new gimmick my composition teacher thought up to torture us? Maybe he can't think of anything to teach today, so he's getting us to fill the time up. Couldn't get away with this kind of fluffy writing in history class. Culpepper hates anything that doesn't sound polished, like from an encyclopedia. Couldn't free write on a job application, have to be perfect and sharp for the boss man. Interviews with Xerox and IBM next week. Hope my resume clicked with them. Maybe bosses do all the free writing. Technical reports sharp and to the point. Math is easier. Formulas, numbers, no words messing it up. Only 5 minutes. Rotten time. This guy's really dumb graffiti. Architects make better lovers. Why? Because they make plans, drawings? For someone who had nothing to say, a little over halfway through the exercise, this writer has said quite a bit, from reflections on the purpose of free writing to the kinds of writing experienced in another class and professional writing situations, and contrasting nature of mathematical expression and the amorous ability of architects. That's quite a lot of material, certainly more than enough seed ideas for a simple essay that might spin out from any one of the casual reflections. You might also think there's a good deal of junk in the above excerpt, especially if the writer were preparing for an essay on images of good and evil in Moby Dick. Junk is one of the inevitable side products of free writing. You always produce more than you can use, but that's the advantage as well. How do you know what you can use for a particular essay until you have some material to choose from? Free writing is one method, admittedly crude, of generating words you can sift through, both to discover focus and to support the focus once you find it. For critical writing, you can refine the technique into focused free writing in which the 10-minute period, or longer, zeroes in on a particular literary work or some aspect of a work, as in the example that follows on D.H. Lawrence's poem Snake. Snake, Garden of Eden, symbol of evil, tempted Adam and Eve, disappeared mysteriously into bowels of earth. Devil, king, graceful not caring, does not bother the man, notices him and doesn't hurry. Man is sorry for throwing logs, stupid and cowardly. Snake is proud, beautiful gold poisonous, not brown, but not innocent either. Etna volcano, smoking reminds of hell, but snake is not totally evil, natural like cattle needing water to sip. Narrator hears voices of education telling him to kill the snake, but doesn't know how to react. Misses the snake when it's gone, but he gets mad when it starts to leave. He wants to keep it around for some reason, says it's a king in exile, a lord of life. Why should a snake be lord? Maybe in the underworld. Maybe the man wants to see what the underworld is like. An animal's in the man's territory. The snake is an invader, but the man makes it into some kind of symbol, but not the old simple symbol of evil in the Bible. Something more. Free writing often runs on, with fragmentary ideas piling up and leading on to others whose connection only the writer could decipher. The technique lets you tap directly and without inhibition your conscious and unconscious responses to a work. Much of the results may have little bearing on a particular assigned topic, but you may also find fertile possibilities for insight in free writing. Brainstorming. Brainstorming is a group activity which, like free writing, aims at rapid-fire production of words and ideas on some particular topic. One member of the group is designated the scribe or recorder, and on a blackboard, overhead projector, or paper, but preferably some medium that the others can see easily, jots down all the words and phrases that people offer. The important thing is to avoid complete sentences or drawn-out explanations. The goal is quick staccato, stream of consciousness, free association stimulated by the topic. In other words, mental thunder and lightning, and all that your group can precipitate over a relatively short period of time. We have reproduced the worksheet of a group that brainstormed on Howard Nemirov's poem, The Vacuum. Notice how the members build on each other's contributions while not worrying about the logical connections. The numbers indicate the order in which they were said. Old lady is a vacuum cleaner. 1. 2. Musty old houses. 3. Dust and dirty work never done. 4. Husbands never clean houses. 5. Flip switch, housewife, slavery. 6. Wages for housewives. 7. Cleaning bag like a lung. 8. Cancer working in mines. 9. 9 to 5. Cocktails. 10. Vacuum is alive. 11. Monster movie matinee. 12. Devour the children. Devour the husband. 13. No children, no love, just work. 14. Husband misses the noise. 15. 3 paragraph stanzas, 5 line each. 16. Only 1 rhyme. 17. Personification, metaphors, similes. 18. What are woolen mice? 19. Is Nemirov Russian, Polish? 20. Vacuum cleaners behind the iron curtains? 21. Machines dominate us, do all the work. 22. No pride in work, American auto workers. 23. Technology gives control or takes away. What can you do with such a brainstormed list? Just as with keeping a journal and free writing, brainstorming aims at loosening up the mind, cracking the shell that surrounds what each of us has to say and so often never lets out to ourselves, let alone others. What you do with the results of brainstorming depends on your immediate circumstances and opportunities. Your instructor may assign small groups to brainstorm the same topic, or different topics, and later to report back to the whole class in order to start a discussion. Or the instructor may have groups use the technique in preparation for an in-class writing exercise. Still, another use might be on your own, to initiate a brainstorming exercise with a group of friends or classmates, to prepare for a group report, or simply to share ideas for an upcoming essay. There are many possibilities. The common denominator is what some educators call collaborative learning, which means stimulating and sharing your thoughts with others by a bit of creative pushing and pulling. The pre-writing portfolio. Now that we've discussed informal pre-writing methods, you may be asking, what do I do with all this stuff? We hope that you've started a literary journal in a separate notebook. As you prepare for a particular writing assignment, you'll find a pre-writing portfolio quite useful. You could set aside several pages of your journal for notes and pre-writing exercises dedicated at a particular topic. You could also start compiling a portfolio in a separate file or folder in which you record on individual sheets of paper or note cards the result of various discovery activities. The more you collect by the way of pre-writing, the more you'll be able to sift through and tie together in your rough draft. Igor Stravinsky, the 20th century composer, used to jot down short phrases of music and tape them on the music rest of his piano for later use. Think of the numerous sketches an artist makes before brushing the first dabs of paint on a canvas, or the schematic drawings an engineer must make to guide the scale modeler in designing a more aerodynamically efficient automobile. The writer, too, needs to build up the tangible written beginnings, the material of pre-writing that can be later shaped into draft of an essay. Formal methods of pre-writing. A writer can use the informal methods of pre-writing to find a topic and to generate ideas when the topic is clear. The formal methods of pre-writing may be used the same way. As you prepare to write critically about one or more literary elements, you will probably experience one of the following conditions. 1. Having a chaotic jumble of unconnected ideas. 2. Having one or two promising ideas. Or 3. Having no ideas at all. The third condition is unlikely if you've written substantially using the informal methods. Whatever the conditions, the formal pre-writing methods can help you organize the first, expand the second, and fill the third. We would like to emphasize that you need not use all the formal methods. One may be sufficient and comfortable. If not, try another. The important point is that at this stage of composing the critical essay, you need some techniques to bring your ideas closer to the first draft. Just as with keeping a journal, free writing, and brainstorming, the formal methods are designed to help you generate material for the essay. The difference is that they allow for a more complete and patterned probing of the literary work than the less structured informal methods. The writing that you produce with the formal methods and add to your growing portfolio, while not necessarily duplicating the final insights of the final essay, will contain many of the ideas, and even words and sentences you can use in the essay itself. You may find the formal methods strange or gimmicky at first, but once you become more comfortable with them, they'll go a long way towards overcoming writer's block. You shouldn't feel compelled to memorize and use all of these methods slavishly. We want to show how the methods work and to have you experience with them on your own to see which works for you. You may find that the pentad yields more useful ideas for you over a period of time, or that focal points are simpler to use than the thought patterns, and that's fine. Read through the discussion and illustration of the 3 methods, practice and try them in real writing situations, in this course and others, and see which are worth building into your repertoire of writing habits. That's basically what we're doing in this text, helping add to your repertoire of skills so that you will be a more effective and competent writer. One thing you'll discover as we go through the formal pre-writing methods is that they all seem to cover the same grounds, but in different ways. Certain terms or steps in one method echo those of another. What you'll be finding is the consistent way the mind works. In spite of the brain's incredible complexity and capacity for memory and new discoveries, its workings can be understood as a limited number of key operations. It's these operations that formal methods try to capture in usable procedures. Thought patterns. How do we understand the motion of the wind, the French Revolution, a mother's behavior towards a child, capillary actions in a leaf, a poem? We order our experience with categories of thought, ways of grouping facts, remembrances, observations, feelings, and conclusions. Sometimes the thought patterns are already explained by an author or speaker. At other times, the thinker, the receiver of language, must complete or supply all of the organization. We can understand this organizing capacity as made up of 4 basic patterns: classification, definition, comparison, and analysis. Classification. We understand a thing, an idea, a person, a place, an object, an event, by fitting it into appropriate groups or classes, and if this thing or concept is large enough, by seeing what classes are within it. Human beings belong to the larger class of vertebrae, mammals. Human beings, according to some anthropologists, consist of smaller classes. The important feature of classification is discovering a basis for grouping. The vertebrate group is based on a single physiological trait, having a backbone. The other groups are based on more complex tendencies, including geographic origin, skin color, facial bone structure, and hair texture. The usefulness of a classification depends on how reliable the basis for classifying is. Witness the trouble and charges of racism created by anthropological classifications. Classification is also a useful thought pattern for developing literary understanding. We use the very large classifications of poetry, fiction, and drama to label genre or literary type. The basis for these large classifications is obscure, but it probably has something to do with different types of performance: singing, telling a story, and acting a story. Anyone who has read literature realizes that the genres are not very useful. Poems can tell stories, plays can be written in poetic form, and fiction can have a poetic style. And so a variety of subclassifications have evolved. For example, under poetry we have classification based on stanza, rhyme patterns, sonnet, terza rima, villanelle, ode, and so on. Rhetorical purpose, epic, elegy, mock heroic, and pastoral, and so on. These formal classifications have arisen over centuries as readers of literature have tried to organize their experiences of so many different forms and purposes. Even though critics rarely agree on the basis for classifications, the effort to find a common set of terms for our experience continues. In addition to classifications of forms, we can classify types of characters, images, settings, and other literary elements by asking the question, what kinds of blank does the author use to blank? For example, what kinds of images does Lawrence use to develop the scene in Snake? You'd first want to identify a basis for classifying, and one basis might be the images of sense. You'd then identify images of sight, the details of the well and wall, the snake's color and movement when coming to the well, drinking, and returning to the earth. Touch, the hot Sicilian day, the imagined feeling when the snake returns to the underworld. Sound, the stillness of the day and the snake's silent drinking contrasted with the voice of education and the clatter of the log that the speaker throws at the snake. And smell, the strange scented shade near the well suggesting mystery. You then might want to note those images that seem to combine senses, such as the smoking volcano, sight, touch, sound, and smell, and the snake's easing its shoulders back into the fissure, sight and touch. Classification allows you to recognize your experience of a work's diverse elements. Definition. Definition is the thought pattern that builds on classification. To answer the question, what does X mean, we first fit X into a class and then show how it differs from other members of the class, as in the simplified formula, X equals class plus differentiation. For example, X equals class differentiation. Anxiety, X, is a kind of fear, class, for which one doesn't understand the clause. Differentiation. Baby grooming, X, is a physical activity, class, with hygienic benefits, removing parasites from the fur and skin, and social benefits, preserving group closeness. Differentiation. An Alexandrine, X, is a line of poetry, class, with 12 syllables. Differentiation. Definitions cannot always be completed in a simple sentence with a simple formula. Often a definition needs to be extended by qualifications and illustrations. Indeed, an entire essay might be built around a definition. Consider the paragraph below, which develops the meaning of growing up in Dylan Thomas's Fern Hill. Thomas shows how growing up is an ironic process involving intensely pleasurable experiences that are slipping away forever. The child knows the immediate pleasures of playing prince and hunter around the farmyard, dreaming of being carried away by owls and awakening safe again at the farm. But the child does not know that these pleasures are only for a short time, and that he will never quite be able to recapture these times as an adult. What is remarkable, though, is the vividness with which Thomas recreates the joy of youth while saving the note of sadness and regret until the end. Growing up, he shows, is both joyous and terrible. In this paragraph, growing up is defined, X is growing up, class is process, and differentiation is the rest of the first sentence. The rest of the paragraph expands and qualifies the definition. As a pre-writing technique, definition can be used whenever you come to a word, a term, a theme, a character trait, or behavior that you or the reader of your essay might have trouble understanding. As with classification, you need to turn the thought pattern into a question that will fit the work in your essay topic, such as, what does death mean for Granny Weatherall? The definition you write in your journal or portfolio might concentrate on how the author develops a definition, or on how the author's definition fits in with traditional meanings. Comparison. As we will mention in discussing metaphor, much of what we will learn about the world comes through comparison. Metaphors are a special kind of stylized, imaginative comparison. With the basic thought pattern of comparison, we look for similarities, shared qualities that enable us to bring things together. Perhaps just as important as finding similarities is the implied opposite, contrast, finding differences. Both comparison and contrast are necessary skills for classification and definition. We identify classes by labeling groups of things with similar traits. At the same time, we define by looking for the differences that set something off from other members of its class. For example, puppets are like marionettes in that they are manipulated to stimulate human or animal behavior. But unlike marionettes, which are operated from above with strings, puppets are operated by hand and finger movements from within the doll's body. Note how we can classify shadow puppets, sock puppets, rod and stick puppets, marionettes, and ventriloquists' dummies. We can ask the question, how do blank compare and contrast of literary elements within a work or between works? As a pre-writing technique in critical writing, there is no end to what you can compare and contrast. Literary works themselves by the same author or different authors, written close together in time or separated by centuries, literary styles, characters, use of imagery, treatments of the same theme by different authors or by the same authors in different work, the list is limitless. Just as classification requires a basis for grouping items, so does comparison require what is called a common ground between items. Common ground is the reason or place for bringing two or more subjects together for examination. A botanist would not compare the molecular structure of blue spruce pine needles with that of sugar maple leaves without a reason, such as wanting to understand the different cellular systems for delivering nutrients. A film critic would have to be interested in something like images of working woman before writing 9 to 5, Norma Ray, and Rosie the Riveter in the same review. And a literary critic would need a focus such as the effects of setting on Francis Weed before contrasting Francis's home in Shady Hill with the site of the airplane crash and his memory of the French town in World War II. In fact, the critical writer needs to look for common ground before looking for similarities and differences. One of the most common critical writing assignments is comparison. Contrast, a type of essay we'll describe in detail in Chapter 5. Analysis. Analysis is the thought pattern which aims to understand how things work. This pattern has two facets: breaking a subject down into component parts to see how they work individually and in unison, and establishing cause and effect relationships in processes or events. Analyzing components and cause and effect relationships is basic to understanding how and why things happen. No kind of inquiry, scientific, political, social, or artistic, is possible without the skill of analysis, no matter whether the analysis is highly rigorous and determined by accepted procedures or unstructured and random. We can't get away from our basic need to take things apart, constructively or destructively. Handled properly, the analysis of literature can be constructive, but people often complain about analyzing, citing the old adage, "We murder to dissect." There is some truth to this adage, because taking something apart to understand it can destroy it. For example, the only way to examine organisms and their parts in an electron microscope is to kill them before or in the vacuum necessary for extreme magnification. After reading certain literary criticism, you come across feeling that neither the writer nor the work survived the critic's knife. But such carnage isn't necessity, and we hope you'll develop the attitude that looking closely at a literary work is healthy and a way to enrich your experience with it. What we're really talking about is analyzing your own responses. The work will remain intact. War and Peace is still read, and King Lear is still performed despite thousands of successful and not so successful attempts to account for their greatness. You'll protect your own literary responses if you always make synthesis, a putting back together with deeper understanding part of your analyses. Literary analysis can focus on the whole work, or it can zoom in on a particular element. We can ask, what are the major components of Donne's poem, The Canonization? The answer would include structure, 5 stanzas and 9 lines in each, a speaker who's complaining to some unknown audience which objects to his love, images of a world that continues unaffected by his love, images of his self-consuming passion and the art that will tell his story, and finally, a prayer in which other lovers will ask to repeat the pattern of his love. If we want to understand the sequence and cause of a principal event or condition in a literary work, we ask, how did this happen and what caused this? Or if we know the cause, we can ask, what are the results or effects of this? The following paragraph was written in response to the assignment. Analyze the effects of setting on Huck Finn in the first chapter of the novel. The setting in the first chapter of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn brings out one of Huck's most important characteristics, his disgust with the civilized world. After telling how the last novel, Tom Sawyer, ended, Huck, the narrator, shows what his life is like at Widow Douglas's house. Because he is such a free spirit, he chafes under all the restrictions. He has to wear proper clothes that make him sweat and feel closed in. He comes to supper at the ring of a bell and may not eat until the widow says a blessing. Huck's description of the widow's sister, Miss Watson, shows his extreme uncomfortableness in the environment. She was a slim old maid with goggles on. She took a set at me now with a spelling book. She worked me middling hard for about an hour. Then for an hour it was heavy, dull, and I was fidgety. Throughout the novel, as in the first chapter, Huck is especially sensitive to the effects of a place has on him, and is at most at home on the river. Notice how this writer uses illustrations and a quotation from the novel, while not slipping into simple plot summary. The writer makes regular comments on how and why the setting affects Huck. The 4 thought patterns, classification, definition, comparison, and analysis, are procedures based on key mental operations that we use to understand information from the world. They can work as very productive pre-writing techniques when each pattern is turned into questions that fit both the literary work and the emerging critical essay. As with the other pre-writing methods, you should use the thought patterns to produce writing for your portfolio. The pentad. Any act, including written work, has 5 elements that can be turned into pre-writing questions to help the critical writer. The writer may want to understand the work's place in literary history or the work itself, and in both cases, the 5 elements and the questions that yield cover virtually everything the writer might want to know. Chapters 3 through 8 will adapt the pentad questions to various literary elements as appropriate. The following chart shows the pentad and its parallel questions for the 2 types of inquiry. Who? Who wrote the work and what biographical information relates to the work? Who are the principal characters? Who is the narrator? What? What is the work? Novel, play, etc. What is the chief event in the work? And what is the theme? Where and when? Where and when was it written? Where and when does the chief event occurs? How? How was the first published and received by the public? How does it relate to similar past and future works like it? How does it reflect or go counter to its cultural context? How is the chief event accomplished? Why? Why did the author make the choices that resulted in the work? Why has it remained significant or insignificant, or which will it become? Why does the chief event happen, and why does the work have the effects it does? The perspective on the work in literary history will undoubtedly require research, and while writing assignments do occasionally ask for research, the more common critical writing deals with the work itself. In fact, before you can fully appreciate a work's place in literary history, you need to be able to read closely and appreciate it on its own merits. The skill in using the pentad as a pre-writing method lies in your ability to adapt each of the 5 elements into precisely worded questions that fit the assigned topic, or that will allow you to discover a workable topic. Let's imagine that you've been asked to write about Ahab's relationship with the whale in Melville's Moby Dick. Remember that writing out answers to these pre-writing questions in your portfolio is the goal of this technique. The who perspective will yield at least 2 useful questions. First, who is Ahab? Beyond the obvious answer that he's a seasoned captain of the whaling ship Pequod, you'll want to note his physical appearance. Tall, proud, detached, with a peg leg made of whalebone, a horrid scar running down the side of his face, and a far-off gaze in his eye, as well as his emotional makeup, fiercely determined to reach his goal at all costs, an almost mystical ability to win the sailors over to his cause. A free-writing exercise focusing on Ahab or a short character sketch could develop your answer. The second question is, who or what is Moby Dick? You'd want to first characterize the physical presence of this mighty beast, its great size and strength and unusual color. Then you need to search for those passages where Melville attributes feelings, motives, even intelligence to Moby Dick, often through Ahab's own words. If you feel a symbolic dimension is worth exploring, you might see the whale as a force of nature, or nature itself. The dark side of Ahab's self, perhaps a tangible projection of his own making, every man's evil, or even a cosmic embodiment of all evil. Such speculation can obviously get out of hand, so be sure you can root all your claims in the work itself, regularly making specific references and drawing out relevant quotations for possible later use in the essay. The what perspective on the topic of Ahab's relationship with the whale might be phrased, what is the nature of their relationship? From Ahab's point of view, it might be a combination of hate, revenge, fear, and perhaps a recognition of part of himself or his fate as he pursues Moby Dick with a terrible, destructive determination. Where and when refer to the novel's setting, so you'd ask, what roles do the land, the ship, the ocean play in the development of Ahab's relationship with Moby Dick? The land is what Ahab must leave to find the whale. The ship is the microcosmic land world which allows Ahab to invade Moby Dick's world. The sea is the scene of their epic battle, and at the end rolls on as it always has, perhaps mocking Ahab's foolishness, or worst of all, not caring. The how perspective might look, on the one hand, at how does Melville portray this relationship, and on the other hand at how does Ahab nurture his relationship with Moby Dick. Your answers might cover Ahab's abandoning the Pequod's task of filling its hold with blubber and whale oil, and his battle of wills with Starbuck, the chief mate, who is bound to the ship's original task and philosophically to avoiding the quest for all that Moby Dick represents. You would show in detail how Melville portrays the relationship through Ishmael's narration, what Ahab says and does, and what others say about him and the whale. Finally, the why perspective asks, why does Ahab relentlessly pursue Moby Dick, and why does Melville make this his novel's central action? The seeds of your answers are in your responses to the other pentad questions. Dramatically, it makes for a startling clash to have Ahab's obsessive personality set against the awesome Levanthian, and philosophically it raises difficult if not obscure questions about man's place in the universe. This perspective allows you to probe the work for what is traditionally called theme. Your answers to the pentad questions on the Moby Dick topic might be somewhat different from those above, depending on the closeness of your reading experience and the novel's importance to you at the particular time in your life when you read and write critically about it. The key point is that you use the pentad to lead you through and to organize your literary experience. If you find it difficult to arrive at a thorough answer to one or more of the questions, you might need to rethink or reread parts of the work. Many readers find that having the pentad questions in mind as they read, perhaps using them as a guide for journal entries, enriches and clarifies their reading. Focal points. If you had the world's most sophisticated camera, with infinite microscopic and telescopic power, capable of making both still pictures and movie film, able to exist in any environment and to go anywhere at any speed, you would have an infinite number of focal points, or views on the world. But while you'd have vast degrees of focusing power, there would be only 3 basic kinds of focal points. Up close, a view of the subject by itself, isolated and distinct from others of its kind or anything else. Notice the similarity with the thought pattern of definition and the pentad perspectives of who and what. Inside, this view would use microscopic power to actually enter the subject, see its parts, how it works and how it changes. Compare the thought patterns of process and cause and effect analysis and the pentad perspectives of how and why. Panoramic. This sweeping view would allow you to survey the subject and its environment in an ever-widening context. Again, compare the thought patterns of classification and comparison and the pentad perspectives of where and when. Imagine a cinematic journey beginning with a close-up view of a rock, moving gradually closer to scan the most minute surface features, then entering a microscopic fissure and magnifying the view 100 times, 1,000 times, 10,000 times, 100,000, until you begin to see the molecular structure of metallic and non-metallic chemical elements, atomic particles, with electrons spinning around proton and neutron clusters, and ultimately zeroing in on subatomic particles and elementary energy fields. Then you stop and begin reversing the focal direction to return to the original close-up view, and beyond that to ever larger panoramic views. You see the stone in a quarry, part of a glacial formation in a geographic region of the state, then a sector of the country, expanding to a global view as your camera leaves Earth's atmosphere and enters interplanetary space. You move quickly past the moon and to the outer reaches of the solar system, seeing the Earth shrink to nothing as the context expands. Now in interstellar space, focusing on where the Earth was and is, you move in light years to the nearest star system and beyond until you begin to see the configuration of the Milky Way galaxy. Now moving into intergalactic space with millions of galaxies, and finally to the edge of the universe and whatever, if anything, lies beyond. No camera is ever likely to enable such a journey, and certainly not in the time it took you to read the above paragraph. But the brain, the instrument that allowed you to make the progressive leap through the focal points, is ready and available, and it can use the 3 kinds of focal points as highly generative tools for looking at subjects for critical writing. Obviously, you won't want to get as close to or as far away from a literary text as our film recorded The Rock, but you can probe your experience of a work and uncover insights with focal points in ways not possible with the other formal pre-writing methods. Let's see how the focal points could work in a critical writing situation. Instead of having been assigned a topic, you've been asked to develop your own on any aspect of Robinson's The Mill, and then to write the essay. As with the other pre-writing methods, the first step is to form questions that fit the subject. The paragraphs that follow are the result of one student's application of the 3 focal points to this poem. Notice how the writing has the stylistic flavor of free writing, with fragmentary and run-on thoughts. Up close, what features characterize the poem as static, separate thing? It has 3 stanzas, 8 lines in each, with regular rhyming pattern A, B, C, D in each stanza. Every other line indented, kind of a sing-song effect all through. Don't think it fits gruesome subject of a double suicide. Hard words, have to look up, mealy and weird. Difficult phrases and lines, have to reread for meaning. Nothing wrong in how he went and what he said. She knew that she was there at last. Where did she go? What else there was would only seem to say again what he had meant. Would not have heeded where she went, though it followed her, one way of the few. Second stanza has the most hard lines, images of chill and death, cold tea and dead fire, smell of the past hanging from a beam, the dark white pond, and where she kills herself. Inside.
How does the poem and its parts work? What is the reader's experience going through the poem? Don't know what's happened at first, kind of like a mystery. First stanza, she's lonely and remembers his depression. I felt something was wrong then. Goes to the mill looking for him. And I didn't know he'd killed himself until line 15. What was hanging from a beam? The third stanza was when I realized what she was up to. Line 19 and 20, hard at first, reading. One way of the few there were would hide her and would leave her no mark. Had to read to the end and go back to know she's thinking of suicide methods. She wanted to go out quiet and undiscovered, like her husband, but she discovered him. Maybe someone will discover her and start a chain reaction of suicides, wipe out the whole town. No, that's not in the poem. Stick to what's inside. Panoramic. How does this poem compare to other poems by Robinson? Similar poems by other poets, and how does it fit into the genre of poetry? Remember Richard Cory by Robinson? The guy who was so nice and liked by everyone in town who goes home and puts a bullet in his head? Robinson seems to like shocking readers with all the dissatisfied people and losers killing themselves. Isn't anybody normal? Maybe a general despair and hopelessness. None of his characters talk to anyone, or when they talk to no one really listens. This poem is very much like Pound's The River Merchant's Wife, a letter, and Williams' The Widow's Lament in Springtime. In RMV, woman stays faithful and lives, but in WLS, the woman thinks about suicide, in a swamp like the Ware in the mill. But you don't know if she'll have the guts like the miller's wife. In RMW and WLS, the women speak the poems. In Mills, someone else tells the story. Has to, because both Miller and his wife are dead. I like it better when the woman talks because you really get inside their feelings. Seems like an old-fashioned poem with the tight stanza and rhyme structure. Not very 20th century, but it was written in 1920. How would it feel to rewrite it with no rhymes or regular rhythm? In-class themes and essay examinations. How you use your time is crucial on essay exams and in-class themes. This kind of writing can heighten writer's block unless you have good techniques for getting words down on that blank page. In an in-class writing situation, the opportunities for discovering and shaping are greatly restricted, but while you're under pressure, some time taken for pre-writing can yield excellent results. Let's first consider the two basic types of in-class writing you might encounter in a literature course. You might be asked to organize an entire essay on a single topic during a class period, or you might take an examination with several essay questions, each requiring one or more paragraphs, but not a full-blown essay response. For both situations, we recommend using 10 to 15% of the time available for the particular question for pre-writing activities. That is, for determining your focus before you write the first word of your response. Here are 3 steps to help you turn panic into a reasonable procedure. 1. Analyze the topic or question. With this technique, you break the topic down into its component parts and circle any key words that call for certain kinds of development or that focus on certain literary elements. Here's an example of what you can do with that topic. What does life mean for Granny Weatherall, and how does Porter reinforce this meaning with imagery? The topic calls for 2 kinds of development. Definition, Granny's understanding of life, and illustration, her understanding as expressed in the story's imagery. Of course, if the topic is vague or you are asked to choose your own topic, then you need to create the key words. 2. Select and try a formal pre-writing method that fits the topic. Once you've analyzed keywords and types of development called for, see which of the formal pre-writing methods seem to work well. We stress formal methods here because you probably won't have enough time to go through the entire sequence, and the built-in structure of formal methods will help you shape your response better within limited time. In the example above, the thought pattern of definition first comes to mind. You could set up the statement, for Granny, life, the subject, is blank, classification, that blank, differentiation. You might fill in the blanks this way. For Granny, life is a struggle that is characterized by frustration in her relationships with those present at her deathbed and with those she has loved in the past. After you have a definition you're comfortable with, you can move to the second part of the question and show how Porter uses imagery to reinforce the meaning of life for Granny. You could simply search the story for evidence of the senses at work as captured in figurative language, and if you knew the story well, that might be sufficient. If you wanted to make your connection of imagery with Granny's understanding of life more organized, you could apply one of the formal pre-writing methods, one whose generative possibilities seemed well suited to the question. Because of the story's shifting perspectives, focal points would be a good bet. Turning each of these 3 perspectives into a relevant question might result in, up close, what images, if any, of Granny in bed in the room reflect her attitude toward life? Inside. When the narrative is inside Granny's consciousness, what images, if any, reflect her attitude towards life? Panoramic. What images, if any, show Granny's attitude toward her life as she relates to others in the past and present environments? Notice how each of the questions ties together the search for images with the first part of the assigned topic, the meaning of life for Granny? The real skill is in the constructing pre-writing questions that fit. 3. Form the initial pre-writing into a tentative thesis. To best address the question, your thesis, or topic sentence for an extended paragraph response, should make an observation on both parts to show the reader that you are directly engaging the assignment. A possible thesis for our example might be, Porter uses images of tension and fading light to reinforce Granny's pessimistic view that life is made up of struggle and compromised dreams. After this step, you're ready to start writing the actual response that you'll turn in. Together, the 3 steps can be expanded into a first draft for a well-written essay outside of class. In their streamlined form, however, these steps work quite well for in-class themes and essay exams by giving order to those first few moments after you see the writing topic and the clock starts ticking. Chapter 3. Theme. When people talk about literature, painting, music, indeed any art form, they often begin and end with theme. What's the theme? What's it about? The author's meaning is, the painting says something to me. The composer develops 2 distinct themes. I thought the movie stunk. It didn't have any point. If there's an idea behind that sculpture, I can't put it into words. It's interesting to note that even with nonverbal art forms, theme always comes down to words. We are word creatures, set apart more than anything by our highly developed language, and we have an almost compulsive need to pile up words and more words as we see meaning and significance everywhere. Theme, we can say, is the ideas and values that a literary work expresses. But as soon as we make such a definition, we need to add important qualifications. If a critical writer views a literary work purely as a dressed-up collection of ideas and values, themes, then those qualities that make it a work of art are lost, and critical writing would simply be a distilling process to boil away unnecessary elements in order to get down to basic meanings that could be stated in other words. Milton's Paradise Lost would be a statement about man's responsibility to God. Ibsen's A Dollhouse, an early expression of feminist self-determination, or Hesse's Siddhartha, a merging of the Western idea of the isolated self with the Eastern idea of personal identity becoming one with nature. It's dangerously easy to lose sight of the epic poem, the play, and the novel when they are reduced to thematic statements. Then they only exist as more or less a valid political, social, or philosophical claim. On the other hand, we can't avoid being aware of what a literary work seems to be about and what it says about the identified subject. This is a central and natural part of the process of evoking a work of art, a process we described in Chapter 1. All the while we are reading and later rereading and writing critically, we're forming a sense of the work's overall plan and meaning, finding expectations, confirmed or denied, modifying or strengthening our understanding until we settle on a final understanding or come to an unresolved confusion. Our sense of aboutness is an awareness of theme. The part of meaning arises from the interaction of all the literary elements and is not stamped on the work either by the author or the critical reader-writer. Our understanding of what theme is can be helped by seeing parallels between the critical essay and the literary work. Essay topic is to literary work subject. An essay's thesis is to a literary work's theme. It's easy to confuse topic with thesis, subject with theme. The topic or subject is some aspect of life, perhaps broad, perhaps narrow, that the essay or work examines. The thesis or theme is a direct or implied statement about the topic subject. While we can say that most good essays have a clearly stated thesis, we can't say this about literary works. Whether they're good or bad doesn't depend on whether they have clearly stated or implied themes or no theme at all. But when a work does have one or more themes, the critical writer needs to distinguish between the work's subjects, what it's about, and the work's themes, a statement about the subject. Type of theme. Here is a list of subjects and possible themes which you may find helpful in clarifying the difference between the two. You might note that most, if not all, sets of subjects and themes come under the broad umbrella of the human condition. Subject. 1. The individual in nature. Notice how many different meanings of nature are implied in the themes. Possible themes. 1a. Nature is at war with each of us and proves our vulnerability. 1b. People are out of place in nature and need technology to survive. 1c. A human being is in harmony with nature as the highest point in its evolution. 1D, people are destroying nature and themselves with uncontrolled technology. 2. Subject, the individual in society. Possible themes. 2A, society and a person's inner nature are always at war. 2B, social influences determine a person's final destiny. 2C, social influences can only complete inclinations formed by nature. 2D, a person's identity is determined by place in society. 2E, in spite of the pressure to be among people, an individual is essentially alone and frightened. 3. Subject, an individual's relation to God, the gods. Possible themes. 3A, God is benevolent and will reward human beings for overcoming evil and temptation. 3B, God mocks the individual and tortures him or her for presuming to be great. 3Z, God is jealous of and constantly thwarts human aspirations to power and knowledge. 3D, God is indifferent toward human beings and lets them run their undetermined course. 3E, there is no God in whom people can place their faith or yearning for meaning in the universe. 4. Subject, human relations. Possible themes. 4A, marriage is a perpetual comedy bound to fail. 4B, marriage is a relationship in which each partner is supported and enabled to grow. 4C, an old man marrying a young woman is destined to be a victim of adultery. 4D, parents should not sacrifice all for a better life for their children. 4E, there are few friends who will make extreme sacrifices. 5. Subject, growth and initiation. 5A, possible themes. A boy and girl must go through a special trial or series of trials before maturing. 5B, manhood or womanhood is often established by an abrupt, random crisis, sometimes at an unusually early age. 5C, aspects of childhood are retained in all of us, sometimes hindering growth, sometimes providing the joy later in life. 5D, a person grows only insofar as he or she must face a crisis of confidence or identity. 6. Subject, time. Possible themes. 6A, enjoy life now for the present moment because we all die too soon. 6B, by the time we understand life, there is too little left to live. 7. Subject, death. Possible themes. 7A, death is a part of living, giving life its final meaning. 7B, death is the ultimate absurd joke on life. 7C, there is no death, only a different plane or mode of life without physical decay. 7D, without love, death often appears to be the only alternative to life. 8. Subject, alienation. Possible themes. 8A, an individual is isolated from fellow human beings and foolishly tries to bridge the gap. 8B, through alienation comes self-knowledge. 8C, modern culture is defective because it doesn't provide group ties, which in primitive cultures make alienation virtually impossible. These are just a few of the many possible literary subjects and themes. The point to remember is that a subject is not a theme. A subject is some dimension of the human condition examined by the work. A theme is a statement, direct or implied, about the subject. The themes about the subjects on our list are still fairly general. As a critical writer discussing a particular literary work, you'll need to bring your observations about theme closer to the work. For example, the last theme, 7D, listed under the subject death, applies to Robinson's The Mill and Williams' The Widow's Lament in Springtime. The kind of critical statement you could make about theme in two poems might be, both poems show that, without love, death often appears to be the only alternative. The difference is that Miller's wife actually follows out the idea in committing suicide, while the widow merely contemplates death. The process of coming to understand theme is first identifying the work's subject and then fashioning a statement of what theme the work makes about the subject. It's important to remember that your first sense of subject and theme may not be accurate, and that you may need to try several tentative thematic statements while reading and afterwards before coming to one that fits the work and your experience of the work. Your pre-writing portfolio is the logical place to record these hypotheses. Thematic terms and elements, form and content. These two terms have been used with so much confusion as to be practically useless in critical writing. Form usually means shape, organization, or structure, but some critics also use it to include anything in a work that isn't an idea, such as word choice, level of diction, syntax, tone, imagery, characterization, sound devices, rhythm, and meter. Whatever is left is called content, the thought that is supposedly behind the work, the message, the theme. The danger in using these terms so simplistically is the same as in relying exclusively on paraphrases to understand literary works. They can give the impression that the work is merely an idea or ideas with layers of literary varnish brushed on to obscure as much as to reveal the theme. Thus we cite these terms more as a caution than as an encouragement to use them. Pleasing and instructing. The confusing division implied by form and content can be traced in part to the Roman poet Horace, who said that the two chief functions of poetry are to please and to instruct. In his view, the poet uses all the arts of language to make a moral lesson palatable. Some call this the sugar pill theory of literature, implying that theme is the bad-tasting medicine that the literary elements make easier to swallow. Again, this is simplistic and unrealistically breaks up the wholeness of a literary work. While both pleasing and instruction may be functions of a particular work, the critical writer cannot achieve insight simply by saying, "I was pleased by this and instructed by that. I enjoyed the imagery of the raft on the Mississippi, and I learned more about treating blacks like brothers in Huckleberry Finn." And what about a work with no apparent themes, such as Pound's The River Merchant's Wife, a letter? How can you sift out what pleases and what instructs in this poem? Saying that the poem teaches us about hope or about Oriental marital customs would force something on the poem that's not there. The reason we've mentioned these two set of terms, form and content, and pleasing and instruction, with caution and even doubt is that literary works do not fit into comfortable niches, part artistry and part thought. Literary historians are fond of tracing the pendulum swings from one period to another, as writers incline now toward textual features and now toward ideas. The next set of terms tries to suggest a range of emphasis on theme in particular works. Didactic and impressionistic. Works that are didactic tend toward teaching rather than providing pleasure. Notice the key verb tend, suggesting degrees of emphasis rather than a fixed purpose. The Bible tends to be didactic, as the principal recorded legacy of a major religion. But the Song of Solomon in the Bible, with its lush and sensuous imageries of romantic love, does more to please than to teach. Impressionistic works tend to have no clear theme and aim at providing pure experiences that are unconnected with ideas or values. An example would be Pound's two-line poem In a Station of the Metro, which produces a single themeless metaphor: faces in a subway crowd compared to petals on a wet branch. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. It may help to picture a thematic continuum. Thematic continuum goes from didactic at 1, with tendency moving towards 3, and then impressionistic all the way to 5. We can place a work roughly on this continuum depending on the relative transparency of its themes, and while we shouldn't use the continuum rigidly, it might help to label the 5 points thus: 1. Almost purely didactic. 2. Tending towards didacticism. 3. Balanced emphasis on theme and literary experience. 4. Tending toward experiential over thematic appeal. 5. Almost purely impressionistic. If the author seems at great pains to convey ideas, values, and beliefs, the works would be placed near the didactic end. John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, 1678, a Christian allegory, would come at the extreme didactic end of the continuum. If the author seems less interested in theme and more interested in recreating a feeling or experience, as in Porter's story The Jilting of Granny Weatherall, the work would fall near the impressionistic end of the continuum. Minor themes. Few literary works express only one thematic idea. Several ideas may have equal status or may function as minor themes in relation to the main theme, much as a novel or play may have a subplot tracing a revealing story about minor characters. Often a minor theme can highlight and reinforce a major theme, as in Cheever's The Country Husband. If we can say the major theme of this story is that modern suburban life is belittling and stultifying, we might say that a complementary minor theme is a person's need to have adventure and romance in life, even if it means fantasizing. The challenge for the critical writer is sorting through themes and determining the major and minor relationships. Reading critically for theme. If you want to strengthen your awareness of theme, there are several literary devices that authors may use to express theme, and you need to notice them in your reading. Direct statements of theme by the narrator. In short stories and novels, the narrator is commenting on characters and events may make direct statements that help identify theme. You need to be careful, though. Narrative voice is not always the author's voice, and may express views contrary to the general import of the work. In Henry Fielding's great 18th century comic novel, Tom Jones, the narrator is almost as fully developed as the title hero, with each part of the novel beginning with a chapter in which the narrator comments on past action, events to come, or the anticipated reactions of critics. Even within chapters, Fielding's narrator doesn't hesitate to jump in and add thematic reflections, as in the following passage on one of Squire Allworthy's good traits. Men of true wisdom and goodness are contented to take persons and things as they are, without complaining of their imperfections or attempting to amend them. There is, perhaps, no surer mark of folly than an attempt to correct the natural infirmities of those we love. Most writers tend not to be nearly so obvious or intrusive as Fielding's narrator, yet if the narrative point of view is not limited, it may express the idea at the heart of the work. In Nathaniel Hawthorne's Young Goodman Brown, the story of a young 17th century Puritan who discovers, or dreams he discovers, the usually religious people of the town at a night of devil worship deep in the forest, the narrator is describing the young man's hysteria and underscores the true horror and theme of the story, the potential for evil within each of us. On he flew among the black pines, brandishing his staff with frenzied gestures, now giving vent to an inspiration of horrid blasphemy, and now shouting forth such laughter as set all the echoes of the forest laughing like demons around him. The fiend in his own shape is less hideous than when he rages in the breast of man. The sentence we have italicized is the narrator's direct thematic comment on satanic superstition and the recognition of evil in man. Repetition of key thematic statements or images. Occasionally, a character or the narrator of a story or the speaker in a poem will repeat an idea or image that directly connects with the work's theme. This technique has its root in the ancient Greek dramatic role of the chorus, a single character or group of voices which would give refrains or repeat the answers to moral questions raised in the play. An example of the technique can be found in Stephen Crane's story, The Open Boat, which recreates the alternating fear of death and hope of rescue of four men shipwrecked adrift in a small boat. Several times throughout the story, Crane injects a kind of incantation, which may be the unspoken fears of the four men, or the larger plight of mankind uncertain about meaning in life. If I'm going to be drowned, if I'm going to be drowned, if I'm going to be drowned, why, in the name of the seven gods who ruled the sea, was I allowed to come thus far and contemplate sand and trees? Was I brought here merely to have my nose dragged away as I was about to nibble the sacred cheese of life? Part of the theme underlying this question, repeated several times in the story, is the idea that there is no justice or fairness in man's fate. Thematic repetition of an image often has a twist to it, as in Dylan Thomas's use of the color green in his poem Fern Hill. In the early stanzas, green is associated with the freshness of joy of youth. Happy as the grass was green, I was green and carefree. Green and golden, I was huntsman and herdsman. It was air and playing, lovely and watery and fiery, green as grass. But in the last stanza, green comes to mean vulnerable, innocence, doomed to lose the joy of youth with growing up. Time held me green and dying, though I sang in my chains like sea. As a critical reader-writer, you need to watch for repetition because it signals material that the author wants to emphasize, usually related to theme. Thematic words and thoughts of characters. What characters say and think often conveys theme. Shakespeare's Hamlet is famous for his soliloquies that reflect doubt about his own worth and the human condition, as in the following. How weary, stale, flat, and unprofitable seem to me all the uses of this world. Fie on't a fie, 'tis an unweeded garden that grows to seed. Minor characters, too, can make statements that express theme. In Cheever's The Country's Husband, Clayton Thomas, the fiancé of Anne Murchison, tells Francis what he thinks of life in Shady Hill. And all the dovecotes are phony, Clayton said, and the way people clutter up their lives. Well, I thought about it a lot, and what seems to me to be really wrong with Shady Hill is that it doesn't have any future. So much energy is spent in perpetuating the place. I think people ought to be able to dream big dreams about the future. I think people ought to be able to dream great dreams. That is exactly what Francis does, and Cheever develops heroic dreams as a major theme in the story. When narrative point of view allows us to get inside a character's head, we are often close to a work's major theme. In Ralph Ellison's King of the Bingo Game, the story of a black man whose life revolves around the hope of winning a bingo game in a sleazy Harlem movie house, the man's thoughts on his dependence on the game express the theme of all people beaten down by chance. He felt vaguely that his whole life was determined by the bingo wheel. It had always been there, even though he had not been aware of it, handing out the unlucky cards and numbers of his days. In addition to illustrating a character's thematic thoughts, this quotation illustrates another literary device, the thematic symbol. Symbolic characters and images. While it is foolish and damaging to the literary experience to go hunting for symbols, powerful symbols conveying important themes can arise with compelling attraction in a work. The critical reader-writer must balance a trust in personal responses to symbols, people and things that stand for ideas, feelings, and cultural values. With a constant guard against forcing the abstract onto the work, this is a precarious balance and is developed through much reading and discussion with other readers. The personified vacuum cleaner in Howard Nemirov's poem The Vacuum is an almost fearful symbol of the speaker's dead wife. When my old woman died, her soul went into that vacuum cleaner, and I can't bear to see the bag swell like a belly. The vacuum cleaner is also a symbol expressing the theme of human energy and spirit in the face of life's drudgery. I know now life is cheap as dirt, and still the hungry, angry heart hangs on and howls, biting at air. A character, too, can have a symbolic dimension connecting with the theme of a work. In Hawthorne's story, The Artist of the Beautiful, Robert Danforth is a blacksmith who stands for brute strength, which is in conflict with artistic sensitivity, represented by artistic watchmaker Owen Warland, as illustrated in the following dialogue. Danforth said, "I put more main strength into one blow of my sledgehammer than all that you have expended since you were apprentice. Is not that the truth?" "Very probably," answered the low and slender voice of Owen. "Strength is an earthly monster. I make no pretensions to it. My force, whatever there may be of it, is altogether spiritual." Such symbolic transparency in characters is less common in modern literature, and some critics are uncomfortable with overly symbolic characters as too contrived. Theme and the formal pre-writing methods. When you generate words and ideas for critical essays with the formal pre-writing methods, thought patterns, the pentad, the focal points, certain parts of each method will help your understanding of theme. Thought patterns. Classification and comparison-contrast are two thought patterns that relate closely to theme. Recall from our discussion in Chapter 2 that when we group items, we look for a principle of classification, a basis for sorting, such as images of touch or ways characters behave in a crisis. When we compare and contrast, we look for common ground among two or more subjects, that is, a reason for bringing them together for examination, such as the use of nature in two poems. You can make the leap to theme by asking, what does the author say or believe about the principle of classification or the common ground? For example, we can classify the characters in Pound's The River Merchant's Wife, a letter, Robinson's The Mill, and Williams' The Widow's Lament in Springtime, as three women who experience the loss of their husbands. We can then get at the poem's themes by stating what the poets seem to be saying about this kind of experience. Pound seems not to express any strong feeling about the subject beyond showing a woman's hope in spite of a suppressed life. Robinson and Williams express the theme of death becoming the only hope after the loss of a mate. Whether classifying or comparing, it is the aboutness attached to literary subject that defines theme. The pentad. Of the 5 pentad perspectives, who, what, where, and when, why, and how, why quite clearly points to theme. Why does a character behave in such a way? Why does an author create such and such a conflict and resolve or fail to resolve it in such and such a way? We know why Francis Whedon Cheever's The Country's Husband becomes infatuated with the babysitter, because his life is empty of romance, a major theme of the story. And we know, or at least we can speculate, why Cheever ends the story with Francis puttering around in his workshop, because few people have the courage, or foolishness, to break out of their niches and fulfill their starved passions. The why of the pentad is synonymous with the aboutness of theme. Focal points. The panoramic, as distinct from the inside or up-close perspective, yields thematic insight when using the focal points method. When you see a character or an idea in context with other characters or ideas, whether in the same work, other works by the same author, or similar works by different authors, you find connections with the world of shared experience. What do Shakespeare's Lear, Othello, and Macbeth have in common beyond their high social and political status and aside from the important differences between the tragedies? They share the ability to look inside at the very end and to understand the human weakness that led them to risk and lose what is most precious to them. Insight into theme often depends on seeing such connections while not forgetting the essential differences between literary elements. Paraphrase. Another way to discover theme which is particularly helpful with poetry is to paraphrase. A paraphrase is an attempt to restate a work in your own words. It is possible to do a word-for-word paraphrase of a short work or a more general summary paraphrase of a longer work. Many teachers and critics object strongly to this activity, feeling that it is severely restricting and reduces a work's whole impact. One critic, Clint Brooks, goes so far as to condemn the heresy of paraphrase, and in one sense his concern is right. If all a reader does is to try to come up with easily understood paraphrases of literary works, the reading experience will be very shallow, and the works will exist only as cryptograms, texts whose features mask meaning and are simply to be uncovered to reveal underlying themes. Yet paraphrasing can be a useful technique for understanding a work, so long as the process of criticism doesn't stop there, but moves on to looking at how the literary elements work together to express theme. Here's a paraphrase of Jeffers' poem To the Stonecutters. You rock shapers, who try to fight the onslaught of the years, have a pessimistic reward, knowing that none of your creations can stand up to time and weather. Poets make their poems in the same despairing spirit, knowing that nothing lasts forever, but even so, many monuments and poems have endured long and given pleasure to the living. From such a paraphrase you might fashion a statement of themes, such as, in spite of their inevitable destruction or loss, works of art may last as long as time, and in pleasures they give, however limited, make the artist's toil worthy. Sample essay. It is impossible to write about the theme in a vacuum. Theme is a recognition of meaning in a literary work, and it arises from the interacting elements of a work. We'll see in later chapters how literary elements too cannot exist or be written about in a vacuum. They contribute to meaning, to theme. The following is a student essay connecting images with theme in D.H. Lawrence's Snake. Imagery and theme in D.H. Lawrence's Snake. Most people fear what they don't understand. Every minute of consciousness, a battle wages in our heads between reality and our subconscious associations. When a fearful association is strong, the mind sees a distorted view of reality, and, acting on misinformation, makes an improper decision. D.H. Lawrence recreates this mental battle between reality and subconscious association in his poem, Snake. His use of imagery in the poem defines this back-and-forth struggle in the mind and reinforces the theme that we should, perhaps, recognize and even accept the unknown, the dark side of the soul. The snake has been a symbol of evil and has represented the devil since Adam and Eve's time. Neither the speaker nor the reader can shake this association. Lawrence reinforces this main symbol with lower world imagery in his poem. Such phrases as horrid, black hole, dark, and burning bowels of the earth, along with the blackness, suggest more than the average snake hole, and strengthen the symbol of the snake as the devil. The image of Mount Etna smoldering is a symbolic reminder also of the dark regions from which the snake emerges, as well as a reminder of potential evil and destruction. The narrator finally associates the snake with a king in exile, uncrowned in the underworld. With this simile, the narrator makes clear the implied associations between the snake and the devil throughout the poem, and unearths some reason for man's fear and disdain for this creature. But as Lawrence uses symbolism to establish the unconscious association of the speaker, so too does he employ a string of similes to establish what he actually sees, reality. Where the symbols are strong in the subconscious, the visual imagery of the poems is just as strong to the eyes and ears and presents a completely different situation from that which the subconscious wants to believe. The snake is seen to have human characteristics in line 41 through 48, acting like a tired man who drank too much. And in lines 16 and 17, Lawrence gives the snake gentle qualities in comparing him to a happy, contented cow. What is interesting in this poem is the way the poet uses two different poetic devices, symbolism and visual imagery, in opposition to each other. The mental battle over whether or not to kill the snake is a thematic battle between cultural tradition in one hand and personal inclination on the other. This theme of confusion is further heightened by the rhythm and sounds the poem has when read aloud, as in the following examples. In the deep strain-scented shade of the great dark carob tree, and trailed his yellow-brown slackness soft-bellied down. These lines are long and slow. They suggest sluggishness and are appropriate on a hot, hot day in Italy. In contrast, lines 22 and 23 are frenzied and have the energy of one trying to make quick mental decisions. What is cowardice? The abrupt changes between the slow, articulate descriptions of the snake and the quick, choppy mental thoughts mark the battle between reality and subconscious associations. The regret that the speaker feels after a foolish attempt to kill the snake expresses the disappointment people feel after having lost an opportunity to understand themselves and the world better. Lawrence never resolves the conflict between the world of cultural value and the domain of the snake. What he does say, though, is that we are diminished and belittled by our frightened unwillingness to take a risk and to understand. Chapter 4. Characterization. As a critical writer, you need to keep in mind the important differences between the terms character and characterization. Character is the larger and more ambiguous term. It refers to the many pieces of information that make up our understanding of an individual: personal traits, habits, actions, experience, thoughts, feelings, beliefs, and relations with others. Of course, a person's character is not composed of pieces at all. Rather, we explain a person's behavior by identifying those character features that seem to be more important for a particular account. Here's the important distinction. If character is the whole personality, then characterization is the deliberate selection or invention of features that an author makes to create a character. It may, of course, serve an author's purpose to control the amount and timing of information that the reader receives about a character. For example, in Romeo and Juliet, the first glimpse of Romeo that Shakespeare provides is through the eyes of Romeo's father and a cousin, who have seen him walking forlornly in the early morning and, at first light, shutting himself up in his room. Until Romeo himself speaks in the following scene, we have no notion of the cause of his mood, and for this early moment in the play, we don't need to know. Shakespeare merely wants to show Romeo at a distance, removed from the traditional feud that brings the Capulets and Montagues clashing together in Act 1. What is important to note is the principle of selection at work. Serving Shakespeare's initial purpose of characterizing Romeo through the reports of others, Romeo's distance from his own family keeps him from the violent hatred that would otherwise close his mind to the future prospect of loving Juliet. If you approach characterization by keeping in mind not only how, but why the author has filtered a character to the reader, you'll begin to understand this important part of the writer's craft. The terms of characterization. Like any special aspect of a craft, characterization has collected special words and phrases that try to classify our experience of literary characters. The terms can help clarify our discoveries about characters, but if improperly used or applied as quick and easy labels, the term can obscure meaning and create doubt about the accuracy of critical observation. Let's consider some of the more familiar terms of characterization. Protagonist, hero, heroine, main character. The protagonist, from the Greek word proto, meaning first, and agonistis, meaning someone who tries to win a prize or a contest, is the main character who struggles and must meet a challenge of some kind in a literary work. We usually call the protagonist a hero or heroine if that person shows courage or fortitude in the struggle, but these terms might be inappropriate for some main characters. For example, Raskolnikov, the protagonist in Dostoevsky's novel Crime and Punishment, kills an old woman to experience what murder is like and alternately accepts and abhors his horrible secret. Would you call him a hero or see heroic qualities in him? Most readers would probably be uncomfortable with a label so traditionally associated with goodness, strength, and virtue. Conflict. The conflict pits the protagonist in one or another kind of struggle, possibly against another character, often called the antagonist, against natural forces, weather, land, sea, disasters, or supernatural forces, gods, spirits, embodiments of evil and good, against social forces or cultural traditions, against him or herself. Literary works often pose a combination of forces in conflict with the main character, as you can see in D.H. Lawrence's poem Snake. The speaker must contend with the snake itself as a potential antagonist, the voice of my education, expressing the cultural traditions of hatred for snakes, and the opposite impulse within himself of wanting to know the snake and feeling honored by its presence at his well. Without something to overcome, without a crisis by which characters are formed or form themselves, without a basic tension, literature and by extension other art forms would bore us. Whether it's Bilbo Baggins outfoxing old dragon Smaug in The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien, or Achilles' epic fight with Hector in Homer's Iliad, conflict is what draws us to follow the fates of large and small characters. Antihero. The antihero is a protagonist who lacks those qualities that gives stature of a hero. That is certainly the more appropriate term for Raskolnikov. The figure of Satan in Milton's epic poem Paradise Lost is also an antihero, opposed to God's favor towards the new creatures, man and woman. Even though Satan is the central figure in the early books of the epic, having broad powers and great pride, he is allied with the blackness and chaos of hell, and all that is bent on the destruction of mankind. In modern literature, the anti-hero may be a comic or tragic figure who breaks with society and despairs of finding meaning in life or a will to live, such as the narrator in Albert Camus's The Stranger, Willie Loman in Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman, or Francis Weed in Cheever's The Country Husband. Minor characters. Minor characters may simply serve the plot requirements of a narrative, or they may be more important spheres revolving around a character. A minor character might be a foil for the main character. A foil is a character who contrasts with another character, highlighting one or more of the other character's traits. In Ernest Hemingway's story, The Short Happy Life of Francis Macomber, Wilson, the hunter guide with his supreme confidence and male ego, is a foil for Macomber, who faces self-doubt and tries to prove his courage in facing the buffalo. Another type of minor character is the double, who mirrors or parallels the main character. The double has a closer relationship to the main character than a foil does, in that the double functions as a kind of echo reflecting an important dimension of the main character. The echo can help the main character and reader see the dimension in a new light. For example, the young captain in Joseph Conrad's novella The Secret Sharer sees in Lagat, his physical double rescued from the sea, the self-confidence and ability to act that he himself eventually finds to justify his first command of a ship. Minor characters can be of major importance in assessing a protagonist or an author's overall skill at characterization. Indeed, one of Charles Dickens's claim to fame is his ability to people his novels with an astonishing variety of eccentric minor characters who, strange as they are, hold up a mirror to all facets of human behavior. Flat and round characters. The English novelist E.M. Forster coined these useful terms in Aspects of the Novel, 1972. Flat characters are one-dimensional, almost wholly associated with one idea or trait, and we do not expect them to change or to surprise us. Squire Western in Henry Fielding's 18th century novel Tom Jones is a flat character, a crude country squire concerned only for his dogs, livestock, food, land, and a profitable marital connection for his daughter. He doesn't change for the better or worse, and we wouldn't want him to. Authors play on stereotypes when they create flat characters, and while stereotypes imply unfair prejudices, they serve a literary purpose when defining certain tendencies in human behavior that the author wants to ridicule or praise. Squire Allworthy, the counter to Squire Western, is another flat character, almost too good to be true. There is no clean dividing line between flat and round characters. When the characterization develops more than one central quality, we speak of fleshed out or round characters whose behavior can be unpredictable. And it's not only the main characters who are round. In Foster's sense, minor characters too can be given depth. Julia Weed, Francis's wife in Cheever's The Country Husband, is pictured both as a class-conscious suburban housewife and a woman not afraid to tell Francis how much he is dependent on her. She packs a suitcase to leave after he slaps her, but decides to stay and take care of you a little while longer. When using the terms flat and round, it's better to say that a character tends to be developed towards one or the other extreme than to use the terms as fixed classifications. The term characterization, then, can help you experience the characters as literary creations. However, the term must be used with precision and not a way of sidestepping the task of reading closely. Reading for characterizations. There are two situations in which you might consciously read a literary work to assess characterization. One, you might have been assigned or be planning to write about this element when you first start reading. Or two, you might be assigned or decide to write on characterizations after reading the work and now have to reread selectively to find material to write about. For both cases, the following set of character questions can guide your reading, and your written answers can become part of your growing pre-writing portfolio. 1. How would you describe the characters in a brief physical and narrative sketch, as you practice in exercise 4.1? 2. Does the character help reveal the meaning of the work? 3. What techniques does the author use to reveal the character? Do they include what the character says, thinks, and does, what others say, think, and do about the character, what specifically the setting reveals about the character, what the narrator tells about the character? 4. Can characters in the work be classified? If so, is there a purpose to the author's including character classifications? 5. Does the character change in any way? If so, how does the change relate to the author's overall purpose? 6. Are any of the characters symbolic? Let's see how these questions would work with the answers strung together in a running commentary on the protagonist in Williams' The Widow's Lament in Springtime. The numbers in parentheses precede answers to each of the 6 questions listed above. 1. The widow is grieving over her dead husband to whom she was married for 35 years. Making her roughly 50 to 60 years old, even the presence of her son is not enough to help heal her sorrow, whereas she used to love the beauty of spring, she cares little now. There is no physical description of her in the poem. 2. The widow is showing the emptiness and desperation of someone who has lost the will to live after losing a loved one. 3. The widow herself speaks the poem, so all the techniques of characterization are filtered through her. What she says is that nothing in nature gives her joy anymore. The one action she describes is noticing the colors of flowers and turning away from them. She expresses one wish, to fall into the flowers and drown in the marsh. The setting, with its bright colors, sets off in stark contrast the widow's gloom. She even projects her sadness into the setting in the first 6 lines. Sorrow in my own yard, where the new grass flames as it has flamed, often before not with the cold fires that close around me this year. There are no other characters or a narrator who says, thinks, or does anything about the widow. For hence there is no basis for classifying characters. 5. The character doesn't change her attitude while speaking the poem, but she does reveal the change from her former joy in spring to the numbness she now feels since her husband died. This change may be Williams's central interest, though there is nothing to indicate the poet's attitude towards it. There are probably not any symbolic dimensions to the widow, other than her representing one kind of response to this kind of loss. Close reading for key character words. An author creates a character out of words, and you'll need to be sensitive to the key words that cluster in passages that describe a character. Consider the following passage. Olga Ivanovna sang, played the piano, painted in oils, modeled in clay, acted in amateur theatricals, and all this is not just anyhow, but displaying real talent. Whatever she did, whether it was making lanterns for illuminations, dressing up, or simply tying somebody's tie, turned out artistic, graceful, charming, but in nothing did her talents display themselves so vividly as in her ability to strike up lightning friendships and get on intimate terms with celebrated folk. The moment anyone distinguished himself in the very slightest degree, or got himself talked about, she scraped up an acquaintance with him, made friends instantly, and invited him to her house. Every time she made a new acquaintance, she was veritable red letter for the next day. She worshipped the famous, she dreamed of them every night. She thirsted for celebrities, and could never slake this thirst. Anton Chekhov, The Grasshopper. The key adjectives: artistic, graceful, charming, lightning, intimate, celebrated, red letter, adverbs, vividly, instantly, and verbs, strike up, scrape by, worship, dream, thirsted, and could not slake, all help shape our impression of Olga as vivacious and creative, but at the same time desperate and quick to grasp at friendships to keep some hold on the world of the famous. The context of the story would permit a clearer understanding of her motives, but a close reading of this passage shows that Chekhov has used many descriptive words to form his main character, so that we see Olga before finally coming to understand her. As you read and reread a work in preparation for writing about characterization, look for those words and phrases that contribute most to your developing picture of a character. A useful pre-writing activity is to make a list of key character words, to draw on later when you write the middle paragraphs of your essay. Drawing inferences from character words. Drawing inferences means reading between the lines, coming to critical insights that are not stated but implied in the work. When you write about characterization, your own words should be as precise as possible, because, in a sense, you are recreating a character in your discussion. When an author uses fewer directly descriptive words than, say, Chekhov in creating Olga, you need to draw inferences by applying your own words to a character. To be true to the author's characterization, using your own words, they should not be distorted, but should reflect the character as embodied in the work. In the following passage from The Jilting of Granny Weatherall, Catherine Ann Porter's narrative takes on Granny's voice as it reflects on George, the fiancé who failed to show on her wedding day, her life after that day, and the nagging fear that perhaps she had missed something in life. Yes, she had changed her mind after 60 years, and she would like to see George. Find him and be sure to tell him I forget him. I want him to know I had my husband just the same as my children and my house and like any other woman. A good house, too, and a good husband that I loved and fine children out of him. Better than I hoped for, even. Tell him I was given back everything he took away and more. Oh, no. Oh, God, no. There was something else besides the house and the man and the children. Oh, surely they were not all. What was it? Something not given back? Her breath crowded down under her ribs and grew into a monstrous, frightening shape with cutting edges. It bored up into her head, and the agony was unbelievable. What could you infer about Granny from this passage? Is she vindictive, vain, regretful, uncertain, ignorant, indifferent, arrogant, stubborn, irrational, jealous, modest, treacherous? Some of these words are accurate, while others are not. She is certainly not modest, ignorant, or indifferent, and probably not vain. No single trait word could accurately describe her here. Different traits come to the surface in her semi-conscious musing. Initially, for example, she is proud and vindictive, wanting to tell George that she survived and prospered with the family in spite of his jilting her. She has had more without him than she had hoped for with him, but her vindictiveness changes to uncertainty, almost a fearful cry of anguish and regret about her unknown life and family she did not have. Just as the author needs precise language to create a character, so does the critical writer in discussing a character. As a pre-writing activity, after having listed key words and phrases that the author uses, try expanding that list with other words that could describe the character. Try making comparisons to recreate essential traits. For example, you might call Granny Weatherall hallucinating, withering, sharp-tongued, demanding, a tree with the sap going out of it. Notice the play on words Porter creates with Granny's last name. The skill is to draw your inferences in words. Here are 13 sets of traits that you may find useful in developing a vocabulary of characterization. Though a dictionary or thesaurus may list some of these characteristics as synonyms, they have shades of meaning that make a great difference when applied to a character. 1. Proud, arrogant, vain. 2. Timid, shy, modest. 3. Unscrupulous, dishonest, dissolute. 4. Stubborn, willful, belligerent. 5. Apathetic, aloof, indifferent. 6. Generous, magnanimous, indulgent. 7. Coarse, candid, rude. 8. Malicious, treacherous, vindictive. 9. Irrational, insane, rash. 10. Virtuous, pious, religious. 11. Jovial, ludicrous, carefree. 12. Jealous, protective, envious. 13. Ignorant, uncertain, doubting. You can make many more sets of traits, in fact, as many as there are individual personalities. Every time you write about a character, you are doing just this. It is important, therefore, to choose trait words that faithfully convey the character to your reader. Characterization in drama. Writing about characterization in plays presents special problems. Unlike fiction or poetry, drama does not usually have a narrator or speaker who can fill in details of a character's backgrounds and behavioral traits. The reader of a play is limited primarily to dialogue and occasional stage directions, more prevalent in modern drama. A theatergoer doesn't have the opportunity to reread a complicated interchange during a performance, but can take advantage of the interpretive skills of the director, the set and lighting designers, and the actors. Most likely you'll be writing about dramatic characterization after having read a play, so we'll concentrate on the reader's limitations and advantages. How do dialogue and occasional stage directions help the reader of the play understand a character? What a character says when alone or with others often reveals not only personality traits, beliefs, feelings, and ideas, but also action. Dialogue may be the only clue to what a character did in the past or is doing in the present. In the following exchange from Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, Faustus declares his allegiance to Lucifer, the devil, as he stabs his arm for the devil's servant, Mephistopheles, to sign away his soul and blood in trade for supernatural powers. Lo, Mephistopheles, for love of thee, Faustus hath cut his arm, and with proper blood assures his soul to be great Lucifer's. View here the blood that trickles from mine arm, and let it be propitious for my wish. But Faustus, write it in manner of a deed or gift. Aye, so I do. But, Mephistopheles, my blood congeals, and I can write no more. I'll fetch thee fire to dissolve it straight. What might the staying of my blood portend? Is it unwilling I should write this bill? Here we have dialogue that explains a pivotal action in the play. Up to this point, Faustus has dabbled in the black arts and wished for more secret knowledge. Now he is playing for keeps and his eventual damnation. The most important revelation in this section of dialogue is Faustus's puzzlement and, we may infer, his fear when his blood begins to clot and he can't continue writing. As soon as Mephistopheles departs for the remedy of fire to soften the blood, Faustus expresses some doubt in a special kind of dialogue called soliloquy, spoken alone, on what is he about to do, almost as if his life's fluid objects to his horrible deal. Later in the scene, after Faustus has signed the contract, Mephistopheles says in another special kind of dialogue the aside, spoken with others present, but only for the speaker's or audience's benefit. "What will I not do to obtain his soul?" As a critical writer, you need to be sensitive to such important uses of dialogue that reveal action, comment on the action, and thereby develop a character. Stage directions for action and set design are usually not very extensive, so that both director and designer enjoy a good deal of freedom in interpreting the physical presentation of the play. These directions can provide clues, sometimes vague, sometimes quite specific, to help define a character. Tennessee Williams's The Glass Menagerie has quite detailed stage direction that directly connects the set to the characters. In the following example, Williams sets Scene 6 as Amanda, the mother, fixes Laura's dress in preparation for her handicapped daughter's first gentleman caller. The family is poor, and there is a desperation to Amanda's sincere efforts to decorate the apartment. A delicate lemony light is in the Wingfield apartment. Amanda has worked like a Turk in preparation for the gentleman caller. The results are astonishing. The new floor lamp with its rose silk shade is in place. A colored paper lantern conceals the broken light fixture in the ceiling. New billowing white curtains are at the windows. Chintz covers are on the chairs and sofas. A pair of new sofa pillows make their initial appearance. Laura stands in the middle, with lifted arms, while Amanda crouches before her, adjusting the hem of the new dress, devout and ritualistic. The dress is colored and designed by memory. The arrangement of Laura's hair is changed. It is softer and more becoming. A fragile, unearthly prettiness has come out in Laura. She is like a piece of translucent glass touched by light, giving a momentary radiance, not actual, not lasting. We might just as well have included this selection in the chapter on setting, but it is so closely entwined with the characters of Amanda and Laura. Indeed, William inserts himself as a narrator with such directions. As we noted, such detail in stage directions is unusual, even for modern drama, so you'll have to be aware of those details of setting that are provided and to what extent they relate to or express characters. It is dialogue that you must read and listen to in your mind's ear, most closely for what characters reveal about themselves and others. Pre-writing methods and characterization. We will now apply each of the three formal pre-writing strategies, thought patterns, the pentad, and focal points, to characterization. Presumably you have been making journal entries while reading a particular literary work and have also done some preliminary brainstorming and free-writing. The material that you generate with the informal pre-writing methods may contain useful ideas, so hold on to it for possible inclusion in your essay. When characterization is the subject of a critical essay, you need to guard against writing merely a character sketch, a simple redrawing or paraphrase of what the author has already said. A critical discussion of characterization involves your relating a character to the work's theme. Remember that the principal ideas embodied in the work also work themselves out and within a character and/or between characters. Thought pattern questions. Our discussion in Chapter 2 identified basic patterns that the mind uses to understand information from the environment: classification, definition, comparison, and analysis. Turning these patterns and their subparts into questions about a character in a literary work makes an effective pre-writing strategy. Classification question. What kind of person is Granny Weatherall? Answer: a senile woman. Note, you may have to answer the classification question several times, making several classifications for a complex character. Question 2. Definition. Question: what is the senility in general for Granny? Answer: a condition of weakened physical and mental capacities, varying in degree and caused by aging. For Granny, her breathing is constrained and painful, and her hearing and sight are alternately clear and clouded. Her mind operates without the usual controls of time and space. 3. Comparison. Question: how is Granny similar to and different from other characters in the story, other elderly persons? Answer: she is apparently stronger and feistier than those around her, and she is aware of them in ways they cannot imagine. Her imagination appears more supple. 4. Analysis. Question: what are the causes and effects of Granny's behavior? What process of change, if any, does she go through? Answer. Her fierce independence and memory of how she always worked for herself make her resentful of her family's and the doctor's protectiveness. As a recollection of the jilting raises new and painful questions, she goes through a stage of anxious doubting about her life, and as death approaches with no answers or sign, she recovers enough anger to will to die. There are two steps in using the thought pattern strategy. First, you convert the thought pattern into a question related to the character you are discussing. For example, classification, what kind of person is Granny? Second, you write out your answer by recalling the story. Even rereading those passages most helpful in answering the question. Again, we stress writing your answers because the generated material collected in an essay portfolio can later become the ideas you work into paragraphs of a first draft. Pentad questions. The 5 parts of the pentad, who, what, where, and when, how, and why, are useful not only for making an overall profile of a literary work, but for focusing on a particular element, such as characterization. As with the thought pattern techniques, you need to turn the parts of the pentad into useful questions. 1. Who? Question. Who or what are the agents, causes, of the principal acts? Answer. Granny's mind, whatever George's motives were. 2. What? Question. What principal acts, events associated with Granny Weatherall occur in the story? Answer. Shifting in and out of consciousness from present to past and back, interacting with Dr. Harry and Cornelia, and, at the end, the rest of the family. George's jilting, Granny's blowing out the light, her death. 3. Where and when? Question. Where do the principal acts occur? Answer. The physical setting is Granny's deathbed. The principal setting, however, is Granny's mind, including her memory and present consciousness as they shift into each other, modified by imagination. 4. How? Question. How or by what means are the acts caused? Answer. Granny's increasingly flexible, though deteriorating mind, her sharp tongue and hearing when conscious. George is not appearing on and after their wedding day. Granny's independent will combined with anger and desperation when no sign is given. 5. Why? Question. What is Granny's purpose? Why has Porter so portrayed her? A. Granny's main desire is to stay alive and get back to the patterns of living and working that had been her life meaning. She also wants George to know that her life has been meaningful without him. Ultimately, when she realizes there's no hope, her purpose is to die. Porter's purpose is to show a very strong person coming face to face her death in the interaction of a love of life with doubts about the life's value. Note, why is the pentad item more closely associated with theme? Focal point questions. The 3 varied perspectives are another way the mind can organize and understand information from the environment. The up-close perspective considers a subject as an isolated thing that does not change and that is distinct from other things in the same category. Notice how the thought pattern of classification precedes their perspective. The inside perspective shows the subject is undergoing a process of change, as having internal features that work towards some purpose. The panoramic perspective sees the subject within a larger system, or a number of systems. Your skill in using the focal points, as with other pre-writing methods, depends on converting the perspectives into questions related to the topic at hand, in this case, characterization. The question-answer format here applies perspectives to a character study of Francis Weed. 1. Up close. Question. What features characterize Francis Weed? Answer. He is a middle-class family man who commutes to work by train, a war veteran, a survivor of a plane crash, and is infatuated with a babysitter. He goes to parties but doesn't seem to have any close friends. 2. Inside. Question. What process of change does Francis's identity undergo? Answer. He is increasingly abrupt and hostile with his family and neighbors. His initial feeling for Anne is tied to his romantic memories of Europe, but as he becomes more desperate, he develops a futile self-image that leads him to seek out a psychiatrist and confess his failure as a romantic. Finally, he appears to submerge himself once more in the blunted life of Shady Hill. 3. Panoramic. Question. Is there a system of traits and motives working in Francis? What larger systems does he fit into? Answer. Francis as a system is alternately pushed and pulled by the environment. To fight the numbing effect of Shady Hill, he tries to spark an affair with Anne, but when his wife threatens to leave and destroy his security, he expresses passionate love for her. In the system of Shady Hill, he contrasts with the neighbors Miss Wrightson in disdaining their tastelessness and feeling pulled under by civilized living in the modern world. In the larger system of literature, Francis compares with all the characters who do not fit comfortably into the world and contrasts with those who find their niches comfortably. Below is a sample student essay on characterization. A character study of Cheever's Francis Weed. Monotony in middle age often arouses the memory and the emotions. John Cheever in the story The Country Husband deals with the anxieties and desperate fantasies of a man feeling his middle-aged doubts about self and home. After nearly dying in a plane crash, Francis Weave, the story's anti-hero, reflects on the lack of substance in his life. Bored and fed up, he needs an escape from the ordinary, controlled suburban lifestyle of Shady Hill, and finds momentarily in a fancy romance he creates with the children's babysitter. Cheever shows his protagonist briefly fanning the flames of fantasy, but then slipping back into the regimentation that initially drives him out. The airplane crash is the first of a series of events that inspire in Francis a desire to escape his midlife boredom. He is unable to communicate his frightening brush with death because of stifling arguments with his children and wife. Later, at one of the weekly parties he and Julia attend, Francis's memory sparked by the Farquinsons' maid drifts back to Paris during World War II and a lovely woman he saw humiliated by an angry mob. But he cannot share this experience for fear of being unseemly and impolite. But the encounter left Francis feeling languid. It had opened his memory and senses and left them dilated. The train of experience excites his desire for change. Anne Murchison, the babysitter, represents the opportunity to escape from Shady Hill. With senses dilated, Francis becomes infatuated with the young girl's beauty and is swept away into a world of fantasy and romance. As he sleeps, the girl entered his mind, moving with perfect freedom through its shut doors and filling chamber after chamber with her light, her perfume, and the music of her voice. He was crossing the Atlantic with her on the old Mauretania, and later living with her in Paris. The next morning, his fantasy is fueled by the image of a naked woman passing by in an express chain. By pursuing the babysitter, he is seeking out his own youth and passion, which he does not find with his wife. Julia tries to root him in the town's superficial concern with appearance and status, neglecting the essential human needs for passion and romance. Francis's new love gives him a new and unusual energy. The autumnal loves of Middle Ages are well publicized, and he guessed that he was face to face with one of these, but there was not a trace of autumn in what he felt. With a bracing sensation of independence, he enjoys the rudeness he shows to stuffy Miss Wrightson at the train station, but his escape, his romantic infatuation, is constantly challenged by the reality of his situation. He dwells on the moral and legal risks if he is caught taking advantage of the young girl. His passionate dreams are interrupted when Gertrude, the local stray urchin, barges in while he is making a pass at Anne, and when the Weed family is photographed for their Christmas card, the heat of the lights made an unfresh smell in the frosty air, and when they were turned off, they lingered on the retina of Francis's eyes. Through such subtle images, Cheever shows how a taint of unwholesomeness and even sensory restriction covers everything established in Francis's life. Francis's final resort to psychotherapy to solve his agonized swinging from impossible fantasy to bland reality is the classic upper-middle-class cure. Even the doctor's office exudes Shady Hill, a place arranged with antiques, coffee tables, potted plants, and etchings of snow-covered bridges and geese in flight, although there were no children, no marriage bed in this travesty of a house where no one had ever spent the night and where the curtained windows looked straight into a dark air shaft. When a policeman mistakes Francis for a homicidal patient, Cheever underscores the absurdity of Francis's position. No, he is not the deviant he is mistaken for. He is not rebellious. He is simply Francis Weed, a country husband who ultimately represses his basic human need for adventure and adjusts to the framework of Shady Hill. The doctor recommends woodwork, and ironically, Francis is last seen in his basement building a coffee table, a necessary appointment for the suburban living room. The character of Francis Weed is a weak one. His life is controlled finely by conditions outside himself. Though he can make no claim to heroic stature, we can surely sympathize with his abortive effort, however desperate and pitiful to break out. Cheever develops him through a series of events that lead him first away and then back to his monotonous life in Shady Hill. His neighbors, the Babcocks, periodically escape by prancing about in the nude, but Francis is a puppet, strung to the town, forever dancing to its tune, perhaps occasionally out of step, but destined to remain a country husband.